This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. A little post-holiday best of episode today with 4 of my most interesting guests. First, Scott Galloway, the professor from New York who knows all about the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples. The guy who gets under the hood and figures it all out for us. Next, Jeffrey Tucker, the libertarian oracle, the man who has very smooth thinking. If you've not read Jeffrey Tucker's work, well, that's on you. You better go start now. Next, Brian Christian, his book which still rings to the top of my mind as one of the most interesting books, Algorithms to Live By. He did not intend it, I'm sure, but it's so trend following. And finally, one of my favorite episodes, because so many people love to argue about this episode. Matthew Walker, the professor, talking about sleep. And trust me, you probably know very little about sleep. I'm not joking. You don't know much. Matthew, he's dedicated his life to it and educates us all. So coming to you just a few days after Thanksgiving 2019, jump right in and get that education, get those insights, and walk away with some brain food. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my first guest, Scott Galloway. Before I jump into my guest today, a quick reminder. My newest book, Trend Following, the 5th edition, out now, 220,000 plus words. This is a massive redo, massive rewrite, massive new content. Heck, the last edition was only around 110,000 words. This is just crazy expansion. Also, the audiobook version of Trend Following is out now. 34 hours. Get in your car, start in California, drive to New York. I will be on the whole time. And also, for those of you that are looking to go to the next level, my flagship product, easily found, trendfollowing.com/products. You not only help the cause of this podcast, but you help yourself, because I guarantee you that I will give severe insights on how to conquer the markets. My guest today, Scott Galloway. He is a professor at New York University's Stern School of Business. He teaches brand strategy and digital marketing. Scott is a serial entrepreneur. He has founded 9 firms. His weekly YouTube series, Winners and Losers, has generated tens of millions of views. Our discussion today is his first book, which I really, really like. The 4, or How to Build a $1 Trillion Company. The 4 would be Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple. You might think that you know everything there is to know about the rise of these 4 companies, the lore, the myth, etc. But there is a unique story to each of these companies. Scott breaks it down to a very granular level. If you can't walk away with insights from these 4 companies that you can use for your world, you're brain dead. You've given up. You're not paying attention. I'm forever thankful to have guests like Scott Galloway, people that are so passionate about a particular subject that they put every ounce of their time and energy in it to bring everything out. It sure saves me and you a lot of time to try and figure this all out on our own. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Scott Galloway. Scott, before we jump into the particular content of your newest work, your first book, I believe, there's a quote that you cite in the book, 1997, Jeff Bezos, given a 10% chance at a 100-time payout, you should take that bet every time. I mean, it's beyond take that bet every time. The expectation is it's in terms of poker or investing, the expectation's on your side. You do it every time. Now, I know to some degree he's making a thought experiment there when he's saying that, but I'm sure, Jeff Bezos in 2017 doesn't get to be Jeff Bezos in 2017 if he wasn't thinking like that in 1997.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he's redefined risk-taking at a corporate level in terms of capital allocation, because while that makes sense mathematically, empirically, what you find in boardrooms and what you find in terms of capital allocation is that most companies will not greenlight an expenditure with that sort of probability. Most boards are in the habit of only allocating capital when there's a greater than 50% likelihood it will work. And so the notion of doing a series of things that only have a 1 in 10 chance of success is a novel idea, and it's proved to be a great strategy for Amazon.
Let's break this down, though. We've got the 4 companies, and I want you to give your big kind of elevator pitch here at the beginning. But you didn't just willy-nilly pick 4 companies. There was a whittling down companies, getting them to a certain level, and ending up at these 4.
Well, first off, these are 4 of the 5 or 4 of the 6 most valuable companies in the world. So just in terms of a straight line market capitalization criteria, these are the 4 that pop up. The likely other ones is people oftentimes ask about Microsoft, or they talk about Alibaba. But Microsoft is a B2B company. I think these companies as B2C companies have greater resonance in our society. And I would argue that these 4 companies are the most influential firms in the world right now, and arguably some of the most influential organizations in the world. With the exception of the U.S. and China, it's unlikely that in aggregate, these companies don't have more influence than any other country in the world or any other entity.
Why don't I let you describe how the psychology that they're employing, the behavioral work that they're employing to get us to love them, to love what they do, and each of them kind of come at our emotions in a different way. Why don't you give that broad picture for each of them?
So a major premise of the book is that these 4 companies have been able to deconstruct who we are as a species and then reassemble who we are in the form of for-profit companies. And it's one of the reasons why they've been so incredibly successful and scaled so fast is they directly link to a specific instinct. So Google, in a modern society, as it gets more affluent, the society itself or the people become less dependent upon a super being. They become less religious the more affluent and educated the society becomes. However, modern day anxieties or questions don't go away. They probably get bigger, and this creates a void for a super being, a void for divine intervention from an authority that is all-knowing. 1 in 6 queries posed to Google have never been asked before. There isn't a priest, a cleric, a coach, a friend, a boss who has so much credibility that 1 in 6 queries presented to that person have never been asked before. If you have children and one of your kids is sick, your whole world stops and you begin immediately praying, and that is posing a question to the heavens and hoping there's some sort of divine intervention and a better answer comes back, or direction or indication, something that's seeing everything. Nowadays, that prayer is symptoms and treatment of croup into the Google query box. We don't know how it works, but we know that it's all-knowing, and then we can trust it, and it'll give us back a decent answer. Google is a modern man's God, if you will. Moving down, one of the nicer things about our species is we not only need to be loved, but we need to love others. Babies that are given good nutrition but have small amounts of affection and love don't do as well, aren't as successful as kids that have poor nutrition but with a lot of affection. So our need to be loved and to love others is instinctual. It's one of the reasons why our species propagates and continues to thrive. Facebook has given us the ability to love at scale, specifically through the empathy we develop with their photos. It's a network effect. It's a chance to create stronger bonds with people and maintain bonds. And it's somewhat addictive as it, again, taps into this need to love and be loved. Moving further down the torso, Amazon is our large intestine. A strategy that's always worked in business is more for less. Why? It's built into us over millions of years that more is good. Less results in starvation. Our ability to have 10 or 100x times what we need in the closet or in the cupboard makes us feel safe. Probably the greatest cause of death over the course of our species has been starvation. So it is literally hardwired into us that the disadvantage of having too much is far, far less than the disadvantages or risks of having too little. As a result, we always want more stuff for less. It's a strategy for Walmart, it's a strategy for China as a nation, and it's a strategy for Amazon. Amazon is our consumptive self. And then finally, moving even further down the torso, once we feel we're going to survive, the next instinct is to procreate. And I believe Apple is now the ultimate device that signals your genes, signals your power or your opportunity or your attractiveness as a mate. It signals wealth, it signals power, and it signals your likelihood of having a random sexual encounter. Apple realized they didn't want to be the best house in the worst neighborhood computer hardware. They wanted to be the best house in the best neighborhood luxury. And the way they do that is with artisanship and an indication and self-expressive benefit that you are wealthy and that you are a worthy mate. Apple's iPhone is the new feathers, if you will, the new Ferrari, the new Hermes. And as a result, because it appeals to the most irrational organ and the irrational instinct around procreation, it has the highest margins. And similar to Hermes and Ferrari that also appeal to our want and desire to express our strength to procreate, Apple has some of the highest margins in the consumer world. So these four companies are God, love, consumption, and sex. These are the four things that in relationship to each other define who we are. These companies are who we are. And as a result, they've scaled faster and created more profits and more influence than any four organizations in history.
I must say, in prepping to talk with you, I watched your presentation, The Four Horsemen, and I have to say I smiled throughout it because, when someone stands up on stage and they say, I basically got 1,000 slides, let's go. So I give you props. You were cracking me up as you went through it. But, it's one of those things where I think people might think they know where work like this is going to go, but you really don't. I mean, we think we know these companies. And I was thinking in prep of talking with you, I was thinking, my gosh, before Facebook, there was a MySpace. I didn't use Facebook for a long time because I didn't use MySpace. I thought MySpace was silly. I still remember InfoSeek and AltaVista being premier search engines. We all know the near death of freaking Apple. I mean, the company almost died. Bill Gates probably didn't step in. There was no Apple. And, then you got Amazon. I mean, Amazon forever was just selling books, was a flat line on the stock price. No one cared. But then all of a sudden, in short order, all of these companies that could possibly have gone other directions, and to see how you tie it all together is really cool. You're a brand expert. You really get into the brands. But one of the things that's happening today, and it's via a combination of, I think Google does it really well, Amazon does it really well. But talk about the idea of how brand is dying in terms of the consumer. And you're talking about B2C for these particular companies. We go on Amazon, we buy something. We're not thinking about the brand as much, are we?
No, we would argue that the era of brand, that the sun has passed midday. The algorithm for creating shareholder value since World War II has been come up with a mediocre product, a mediocre shoe, a mediocre sugary drink, even a mediocre car, and then wrap these very tight brand codes around it, whether it's American patriotism or European elegance or feeling younger in sort of a hip urban way, and then use what has been traditionally very cheap and very efficient broadcast media to deliver creative messages that reinforce those intangible associations and wrap this mediocre product in wonderful intangible associations. Then put that product as far and as wide through the distribution channel as possible, and then charge an irrational price premium for it. And that's primarily been, if you will, the axiom for creating a great deal of shareholder value in a consumer company. The world has changed, though. We no longer need to defer to the unknown brand. If I'm looking for a hotel in London, I used to stay at the Four Seasons or the Ritz-Carlton, because those two brands always did an 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. But now with TripAdvisor, now with my social graph, I can find the exact hotel I want near the exact location that has the exact vibe. And we no longer always need to defer to the security, to the shorthand of a brand. I have a shaved head, and I used to have to defer to Norelco or Braun or Wall, but now I can go on a blog for men who shave their head and find out about a hair trimmer out of Germany produced in an old factory that used to produce German tanks. we can find what we need on our own with these new tools of diligence. So as a result, the number of people who can name their favorite jewelry brand, their favorite retail brand, their favorite luxury brand has declined between 30 and 50% just in the last 10 years. Why? What's your favorite brand? Your favorite brand is whatever Google tells you is your favorite brand at that moment. So brand equity as a vessel for getting us from the sea, across the sea of the known or to the known from the unknown isn't as needed as much because we have these new bridges, Amazon reviews, our social graph, Google. So we no longer need to defer to the brand. The era of brand building has passed midday. The new algorithm for value is a superior mousetrap with a more innovative way to buy it and the ability to do the diligence that brings product quality to life. A better mousetrap, a better product is the new black again. Great breaks through, whereas it used to be a tree falling in the forest. If you have a truly 10x product, word will get out.
If you're selling something and you don't care, people aren't buying. I mean, for example, when I was watching your presentation, you just know that Scott Galloway really cares and has done the work. Look, I can think of my memories of these 4 companies. I've got a lot of insights about them, but I watch you present and I'm like, hold on. Yeah, okay, I know something about these companies, but this guy has spent a shitload of time doing the homework, and that caring causes people to come over to your side.
Well, thanks for saying that. I think these companies each represent something super unique about who we are. I think that, as I said, they tap into an instinct. The question is, have they become so powerful that they could potentially be bad for our society? If you had, say, Nokia or RIM out of Waterloo produce a phone that the terrorists in San Bernardino had been using to communicate, and the manufacturer, Nokia, had refused to allow the FBI court order or disputed the court order to break into the phone to see if other attacks were imminent, I believe immediately we would have proposed a trade embargo against the country of Finland. But because it was an Apple iPhone, it sort of taps into this idolatry of the iPhone that is unmatched by any other company. And in my opinion, we end up making bad decisions. You can have blood drawn from your body against your will in the U.S. if you're suspected of DUI. If your spouse goes missing, they will get a search warrant, search your house, search your computer. But we've decided that the iPhone is holy. It's almost achieved religious status. With Google, Google now has 90% share in Europe and high 80s in the U.S. Google's search revenue is now greater than the entire advertising market of every country with the exception of the U.S. And you could really argue they have monopoly power, yet they're able to avoid regulation. Amazon has been able to aggregate $500 billion in market capitalization, becoming the 4th most valuable company in the world, and has effectively paid no tax. And until 4 or 5 years ago, they paid no sales tax. Consumers and the government were subsidizing Amazon, paying no taxes, such that it could rocket to be the 4th most valuable company in the world. When you have the 4th most valuable company in the world not paying taxes, the question becomes, how does society function? If the most successful company in America doesn't pay taxes, that means that the less successful companies have to pay taxes, putting them at a disadvantage. Is that what we want in terms of our business environment? Who's going to pay for our soldiers, our nurses, and our firemen? Facebook has decided they're no longer a media company, a company that provides content and then runs advertising against it, which most of us would argue sounds like Facebook. But they're a technology platform. So when there's a ton of fake news 7 to 10 days before the election, running up to the election, and they show that consumers believe things that aren't true and make bad decisions in the voting booth, Facebook says, look, it's not our fault. We're not a media company. We're a technology platform. That's tantamount to McDonald's saying that after being discovered 80% of their beef was fake and people got sick, hey, look, we're not a fast food restaurant. We're a fast food platform. So I believe these firms have aggregated so much power in the marketplace that it creates a series of problems. I believe power corrupts. It's not that they're bad people. It's just that in a capitalist society, you're always going to want more, and you're going to want to increase the value of your company's value from that point in time, regardless of how ridiculously valuable it's become. And as a result, they leverage their power to an extent that I think could be unhealthy. These companies now have a combined market capitalization that's greater than all but 5 or 6 nations. The strange thing is they don't employ very many people to create that sort of value. So we have a a distribution of wealth or an income inequality effect that these companies sort of are the accelerant for. The heroes of yesterday, Intel, 120,000 people, $130 billion in market cap. A somewhat similar number of households supported by Unilever for a similar market cap. General Motors, probably about a $50 billion market cap and hundreds of thousands of employees. Facebook has a $450 billion market capitalization with 17,000 employees. Job loss, job destruction, tax avoidance, perhaps becoming too powerful in terms of skirting regulation and being immune from government oversight. We have to begin to ask, have these companies, because they're so outstanding at what they do, have become too powerful? And do they need to be regulated, or do we need to begin having difficult conversations around some of the features and outcomes of these companies?
These particular four, their rise to power has taken place, has coincided with the most recent bull run from March of 2009. You have to wonder, when you have these four companies, and as you just described them in the unique place they have, how much cover they have, because, for example, so many people have boosted passive index retirement accounts based on these four companies. It's kind of an interesting incestuous union.
Yeah, there's an unusual relationship between the markets and these companies, or specifically Amazon probably demonstrates it the best, and that is Amazon has replaced profits with vision and growth. And that relationship between the markets and a company is that at some point you have to begin returning profits to the investor in exchange for their share in the company. And the amount of that profits indicated the demand for that stock or that share of value or that share of ownership, and would drive the stock up. Amazon has replaced profits with vision and growth, and that is the market does not demand profits from Amazon. It's effectively been able to get to the fourth most valuable company in the world without ever showing any meaningful profits. Is that good? Can we sustain that? Because as a result, it's impacted the entire ecosystem. The new unicorns of today, the new private companies and recent public companies demonstrating huge value, also share that feature. So Snapchat will do approximately $500 million in sales and will lose $600 million. Snapchat will lose more money this year than Amazon ever lost in any single year. Uber will do about $7 billion in sales and lose $3 billion. We've never seen this rubric where we've never seen this axiom or this algebra of losses on this level across the entire startup ecosystem. And the question is it a good thing? Does it end badly when the music stops? But Amazon has basically trained the entire venture community to pursue companies' growth, to pursue their their differentiation, but to ignore profitability. It's a strange thing. It's a feature only unique to Amazon.
Speculate some for me. I mean, you are in the middle of researching, studying. You're involved in trying to understand these particular firms. Of course, looking into the future is very difficult for any of us. But speculate, if the entire ecosystem of Silicon Valley right now is based on, let's just get these massive market caps, profits be damned, at least right now. I mean, I guess, you and I can both look at the S&P in the last 16, 17 years. We've seen two 50% declines. It's easy to imagine another 50% decline at some point in time in the future. Warren Buffett is fond of saying that if you're in the market and you can't tolerate a 50% decline, you shouldn't be in the market. So why don't you speculate some from your perspective about what could unfold?
Well, this strategy works until it doesn't. And as long as cheap capital is around, Snap is fine, Uber is fine, WeWork is fine, Blue Apron is fine. But what happens if all of a sudden there's a shock to the system and the markets demand profits or capital becomes much more expensive? You could see a number of businesses literally just become a shadow of themselves in terms of the cuts they would have to make, in terms of investor perceptions. And the question is, could that be the spark that torches the market? We know we're due for a correction. The thing about the markets is somewhat epitomized by what Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, said, and that is, when asked to define a financial crisis, he said something that happens every 7 years. Well, it's been 9 years since our last financial crisis, so it's not whether we'll correct, it's a matter of when. And the issue is it always comes from a place you're not expecting. And I wonder if it's going to come from some of these companies that have been burning unbelievable amounts of capital and may not show profits or the prospect of profits for quite a while, if ever. And if the market seizes on those first, and then that infects the entire market as people just assume that these new economy companies are going to keep going up and up and up. Now, having said that, when guys like me start predicting where the next correction will come from, that almost guarantees else. So we'll see.
Hey, let's go into something that's near and dear to me. I love the term zero sum. In the trading world, you can see this across futures markets every day. Speak to Amazon a little bit more and the zero sum nature of Amazon. Amazon hasn't just risen to its highs on the back of some independent new channel. There's been other companies, and this is the way capitalism works, but there's been other companies that have taken it on the chin at the expense of Amazon's rise. Why don't you try and give the audience a little bit of a perspective on that?
So if you look across its categories, Amazon, most people would say, is primarily in the business of retail. And retail has largely been a zero-sum game for the last 5 or 10 years. And that is, while it's come back in some sectors pretty aggressively, it's not growing faster than inflation. As a matter of fact, retail in some sectors is growing more slowly than inflation because consumers tending to spend more money on experiences, on coffee, on technology than they are in stuff. So you have an environment that is largely zero sum called retail. And when you have Amazon, who's added the entire top line of Sears, Macy's, and Nordstrom in the last 7 years to their top line in retail, it just begins to suck some of the oxygen out of the room for everybody else. When they're growing their business by $20 or $30 billion a year, that's going to come out of the hide of traditional retail. It is a zero-sum game. With Facebook and Google growing their business combined about $20 billion a year, and we're talking about the advertising business, which is a low-growth business that just kind of mimics GDP growth. So it's sort of barely keeping up with traditional growth. And a lot of people would argue that now it's no longer a growth business, not even maintaining a pace with GDP or inflation. When Facebook or Google take $20 billion out of the ecosystem, you know you're going to have more announcements like the kind you did 2 days ago where WPP, the traditional community, says our numbers are weak and the stock's off 11%. Every other media company, even in digital marketing, is under attack by Facebook and Google, who are now responsible for 103% of all digital marketing spend growth. Meaning that if you're in the world of banner advertising, if you're in the world of some sort of online video optimization, if you buy media for companies online, if you're not Facebook or Google, you join newspapers, you join magazines, and that your sector is in decline. Digital marketing is a great place to be, as long as you're working for one of two companies, Facebook or Google. The same is true in media in general. Facebook and Google are beginning to suck oxygen out of a room that has a static amount of oxygen. And we're going to see a lot of traditional media players, that is from broadcast stations, agencies, to even digital marketers, start to gasp for air.
You know, you describe these four companies, and just you'll see where I'm going with this, but you describe, Apple is a machine, Facebook's a social network, Google is search, Amazon's a store. What's really interesting, these disparate places from which they come from, but now the four of them almost every day are in coming upon each other's businesses. So it's this, they came from four very different places, and they're kind of all moving towards similar places.
Yeah, people ask, well, what do we do? How do we safeguard against the power these four firms are aggregating? And probably the best safety check, or regulator, if you will, is the fact that they hate each other and they're increasingly encroaching on each other's territory. They used to be fine to just go after befuddled prey in their respective sectors, but now they're increasingly bumping up against each other. What's unusual about the Venn overlap of where they are competing against each other, that in most instances where one of these companies starts to face or compete with the other, one of them is winning, and that one firm is Amazon. So where are they competing against Apple? Siri was the premier voice technology. Amazon has leapfrogged them and now controls 70% market share of voice commands. Who would have thought that the most innovative hardware product of 2015 and 2016 wasn't the Apple Watch, wasn't Apple Pods, it was Amazon's Alexa, where they bump up against Google in search. 45% of product searches used to be done on Amazon, which is impressive. That was 2015. By 2016, it was 55%. So they grew their search volume 25%. So in the world of product search, where they bump up against the search company, Google, they are winning. When we talk about general media spending, Facebook and Google, Amazon Media Group that sells advertising on the platform has grown about 40% each year for the last 5 years and is now bigger than Snapchat in terms of revenue and should be bigger than Twitter in 2 to 3 years. So Amazon now has the largest not the largest, but the fastest growing media operation. So where they bump up against any of these firms, even if it's video streaming, you think, okay, they're competing against Amazon, competing against Apple and iTunes. In 2015, 2% of all streaming video time was on Amazon. They were number 7. Just a year later, they had doubled their time to 4%, and they're now number 3. So these companies are all amazing, but one seems to be pulling away. And my prediction is that Amazon is going to be the first trillion-dollar market capitalization company, as wherever you see it bumping up against the best firms in the world, it's winning.
Speaking of best firms in the world, even though it's not a topic directly of your book, I would love for you to go back in time a little bit and lay out for the audience, because if we had to go back, I don't know, to the early 2000s or whatnot, Microsoft would have been considered, probably by market cap, might have been one of the biggest at the time, if not the biggest. Can you, from your perch, give a perspective on Microsoft? How did Microsoft not put themselves in a position to be one of these 4? There's some bad decisions, a little unlucky, or was there some very strategic choices they decided to go in just directions that were not wise?
By any standard, Microsoft is a super impressive company. And even though they're no longer as dominant as they used to be, if you look at the companies that were the largest market cap companies 20 years ago, I think it was Exxon, Walmart, I think Microsoft was in there, maybe with General Electric was in there. All of those companies are gone with the exception of Microsoft. That's still, I believe, in the top 5 or 6. So Microsoft, and especially of late, has been one of the best performing companies from the stock standpoint over the last 24 months. Now, so how did they, if you will, I don't want to say give up their lead, but how did they let others creep in and even move a little bit by them? Primarily they missed probably the 3 biggest trends in technology. They missed search, they missed social, and they missed mobile. If Microsoft had been able to offer, say, a leader in any one of those 3 fields, they would probably be the most valuable company in the world. But they missed these just enormous tectonic shifts in consumer, in B2B, specifically mobile. They bought Motorola, but they weren't able to develop a handset. They missed search, which has created more revenue than I think any technology trend. Now we're now $100 or $120 billion market. And on social, they were never able to produce a social product, and neither has Google for that matter. But basically, Microsoft continues to have a cash machine in the form of Office. It's still unbelievable. They have a super robust, to their credit. They did get the latest big trend correct, and that is the cloud. Their key competitors in cloud, I think number 2 or number 3. They are what you would call kind of have new mojo. But yeah, they did miss some awfully big trends in technology over the last 20 years.
Let's talk about leadership for a moment. I mean, most people will know that Apple's godlike leader is no longer with us. The guy that single-handedly almost just brought the firm back to life. Again, as I say, with a little bit of help from Mr. Gates at Microsoft. But why don't you speak to the leadership of all 4 firms right now, and perhaps where your interest lies in terms of, look, there's one guy in charge of Facebook. There's one big name we all know. There's one big name in charge of Amazon. Apple is more of a corporate structure right now. We hear about Tim Cook. And the Google guys are kind of low profile. I think would be a fair way to describe them. Why don't you, from your perspective, give some of the things that you really like about these guys? For example, Jeff Bezos. What can the average person take away? I mentioned at the top of this show the idea of expectation, but what can the average person take away from an understanding of Jeff Bezos that might help their life improve?
Well, so Jeff Bezos, I think, there's so much there in terms of leadership. Realistically, Jeff Bezos will probably go down as the best CEO of arguably the last 50 years, especially after he steps down. But what he has done is he's really brought a focus on a few things and a long-term focus that totally ignores short-term considerations or short-term shareholder value that's paid off in spades. So if you look at his 1997 memo saying that we're going to invest deeply and broadly across a very few things that we know will always matter and be relevant to the consumer. We always know the consumer wants a product for less. So I don't think that's going to go anywhere. We know they like selection. We know they want it, it's a choice. And then we know they want it fast. And actually the third thing was probably the most interesting thing that other consumer companies didn't get was how important fast was, especially in the world of online with respect to delivery and combining fast with free. But they've invested across those three things probably to a greater extent than almost any firm in the world. And at the same time, have tried a bunch of crazy things, sort of this, as you pointed out, 100 home run idea with a limit, so they do a lot of tests, a lot of failures, but occasionally something pays off big. But it's their willingness to make these sorts of staggering, breathtaking investments across those truisms of the consumer, speed, selection, and price, that has really kind of shown new vision or been really visionary to the markets. That I know people want it faster, so I'm going to spend literally billions of dollars on a fulfillment infrastructure that now has resulted in a factory a warehouse that is within 20 minutes of 45% of the U.S. population. That's a sort of analog moat that is very hard to overcome. And consumers know fulfillment and speed is important. We didn't realize how important. So this sort of long-term vision and willing to do whatever is required in the short run to establish those competitive moats has made Amazon arguably the most competitive company or the company that is most dominant or hardest to deal with. In terms of Apple, I think it's difficult to underestimate that, how difficult it must have been for Tim Cook to fill Steve Jobs' shoes. A lot of people would say that there hasn't been a truly breakthrough product so far, and that will be the true test of Mr. Cook's leadership. But you have to give the guy tremendous credibility for essentially tripling the value of the company since Mr. Jobs' death. So he definitely knows how to run a business. He understood and saw how powerful and the vision of the iPhone in terms of its relevance and its ability to become the most cash or profit generating item in the history of mankind. This is a company that will do double the profits in this quarter that Amazon's done in its entire life. So you have somebody here who really understands how to run a business, if you will. And Apple has pulled off the impossible. Companies are usually one of two things. They're very successful companies. They're either the low-cost leader that has massive scale or the premium price product. You're either Walmart or you're Tiffany, and they're both great ways to make a lot of profits. Apple is the first company in history to pull off the impossible, and that is it's a low-cost leader, meaning it produces phones at the lowest cost because it has the best-selling phone in the world and is able to put together a phone of that quality for the lowest price. But at the same time, it's the price leader, and that is it's the most expensive product on the market. This is as if an auto firm had the margins of Ferrari and the production volumes of Toyota. As a result, Apple is a cash machine and generates more profits than Amazon, Apple, and Facebook combined.
The cash they have in the bank is off the charts.
I think it's the GDP of Finland. I mean, Apple's cash is worth more than the entire Russian stock market.
That's crazy. Right?
So you have a company that generates just staggering amounts of cash. When you talk about Facebook, you talk about the most agile company in the world. Just 4 years ago, Facebook received 0% of its profits, 0% of its revenues from mobile. They said, look, we were wrong. It's not the mobile web, it's mobile apps, and we need to go hard at mobile. Now, the 80% of time spent on your mobile phone is in-app. 5 of the top 10 apps are all Facebook. So now the mobile phone is not only something that Facebook is good at. You could argue that mobile phones are just the technology supporting Facebook. As the number one share of time on your screen is the company that got 0% of its revenues just 4 years ago, and now it gets about 85% of its revenues from mobile. So that could be argued as the most impressive pivot, or you could say that management team is the most agile management team we've seen. We've also seen, just from an HR standpoint, someone who's very young and recognizes they're very young and has tremendous self-awareness and immediately brought in what I would call adult supervision or grade management in the form of Sheryl Sandberg. And they've been a fantastic team. So this, in addition, Facebook, tremendous leadership or vision around acquisitions. The boy CEO was received tremendous criticism for his irrational, stupid purchase of a company with only 19 people for $1 billion called Instagram. A few years later, people value Instagram somewhere between 60 and 100 billion. It's probably more like 150 now. It's arguably the best acquisition in the history of technology.
Does Zuckerberg have the most power of any of the leaders of these four companies?
That's a good question. I would argue that it's probably, it depends what you mean by power. In terms of actually what they could do covertly, I would argue Google is basically can nudge our entire society one way or the other, because the credibility of the answers it gives back have so much veracity among the 2 billion people who use the search engine. So on a day-to-day level, I think Google is God, and I think God is a pretty powerful entity. In terms of individuals in our society or their power in the business community, their influence as individuals, I think Jeff Bezos has so much power now that Jeff Bezos can just make an announcement that they're thinking about getting into a certain category, and the companies in that category will immediately begin to decline in value. He has become a Jedi master, if you will, and can perform Jedi mind tricks, and that is by just thinking about entering another business, he can begin to kill other companies. He can kill companies with his mind, or specifically a press release. But all of these firms have leadership that will be first ballot Hall of Fame business leaders. They're all unique. They all bring different skill sets, but they are exceptional at creating shareholder value. They're exceptional at creating cultures that are very productive. And they build truly, truly unique entities. You know, it's hard. It's sort of a race between, you know, who's a better athlete, Usain Bolt, Michael Jordan, or, you know, Chris Everett. I mean, you're talking about just some of the best athletes in history here. It's not who's better. It's just remarkable just how incredible each of them are.
To your credit, you are not just going down the bright, sunny side of each of these companies. You're doing something that, frankly, I think a lot of people, and you do it obviously in a very educated way, but you do lay out the potential negatives here. And I think a lot of people today would probably feel uncomfortable saying certain things because there is a certain amount of power. And I would love you to go off in a little bit of direction and give me a little bit of your soapbox view on this. But all four of these companies, as far as I know, have a very distinct political view. And America is a very divided place these days. I think you kind of can draw a line down the middle of America and say there's a left and a right, and they're both yelling at each other. Nothing's really happening except a lot of yelling. But the four companies, and I don't think there's going to be much disagreement, including obviously stock market capitalization. That can't be fooled. But these four particular companies have chosen or have political views and directions that are probably very different than half the country.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. The calculus kind of post-World War II would be, in terms of politics, to stay out of it. And people could argue, you know, maybe in the 80s, that companies tried to present somewhat of a conservative viewpoint because conservatives in the 80s were seen as more responsible with money and Democrats a little bit more subject to hyperbola. It is clear that from a political standpoint, it is better for these companies to present a somewhat progressive left posture. And I'm not doubting that is actually what's in their heart, but it also puts to their shareholder value, and these companies are comfortable with them sharing their progressive values. Now, why is that? Conservatives, for the most part, are perceived as smart but mean, and progressives are perceived as nice but weak. If you had a smart but mean person running a firm this powerful, similar to how people perceive the leadership of Microsoft in the 90s, I think regulators backed by an angry populace would be more likely to step in and regulate them. But no one's going to regulate. It's impossible not to like the first openly gay CEO of a Ford company. It's impossible not to like a woman who's fomenting this interesting conversation around women in the marketplace. It's impossible to not like Larry and Sergey, who embody kind of the immigrant gene and the successful immigration and dream of America. And it's impossible. I think it's impossible not to respect and just admire Jeff Bezos and his vision. As a result, all lawmakers want to hang out with the hot girl or the hot guy. And these are those four people. This is prompt queen and quarterback wrapped up into one. And so they play by a different set of rules. When Facebook acquires WhatsApp, and EU regulators are nervous about the privacy of sharing data when they're reviewing the acquisition. Facebook claims it would be impossible for them to share data between those silos in the short or the medium term, and the EU approves it. So Facebook acquires WhatsApp. EU regulation is concerned about them sharing data between silos of WhatsApp and Facebook, and basically says we want to block this unless you can show us you can't share the data. And Facebook claims it would be impossible for them to share data. Spoiler alert, they figure it out, and the EU feels lied to and fines them $116 million. Now think about the fine of $116 million on a $19 billion acquisition. Yeah, so the EU fine against Facebook for lying to them about data sharing between their proposed acquisition of WhatsApp and Facebook was $116 million, or 0.6%. So basically what our government, backed by our population, is saying to these companies is the smart business strategy is to lie. So even Facebook, that was fined $2.5 billion for not complying with competitive rules in Europe, $2.5 billion, the announcement of the fine had absolutely no impact on the stock and only represents about half a quarter's free cash flow. So the dynamic here is the government is giving out 25-cent parking tickets for meters that cost $100 an hour. We've basically said to these companies, vis-a-vis our elected officials, that the smart thing to do is to break the law.
As you were giving some commentary on the political side, and we can kind of wind down here, I'll let you express yourself on it. But I was thinking, I could care less what political persuasion that these particular companies have. They do have monopoly power, I think. And I think as long as they kind of use it for the good and a certain fairness, I think that's fantastic. And I don't think, hey, that's the way life goes, I mean, somebody else could start another company in 5 years and they could be conservative. It could be bigger than all these four. Who knows? I think the only thing that I hope they don't go down the path on is, and this is kind of a political question or a political perspective. All of this is held together with speech and a certain free speech. And one of the things that I love about progressive views and liberal views is they've always been the ones that have said, you know what, I might dislike hate speech, but you know what, we got to let hate speech is part of free speech. And I'm starting to see in the headlines and some of the storylines where we seem to be crossing lines. And it's actually, I'm not really sure what kind of politics it is. Maybe it's corporate board politics, just get rid of the problem, because a true progressive perspective has always been about, hey, free speech number one. So I guess that's my personal view, and I'd love to hear yours too. My personal view is I think as long as they keep everything to where we have the ability to voice our opinions and voice ourselves, then hey, you know what? Let's all go along for the ride. It's the censorship part that I start to get a little bit nervous about.
I think your view is shared by a lot of Americans. There's a reverence for free speech. There's a notion that these companies should be allowed to be as successful as they are because they've earned it. I'm not even sure I'd put forward a viewpoint one way or the other. What I think we need, though, is more open, honest discussions. I think we need a more robust discussion around whether or not these companies are paying their fair share of taxes. I think we need a more robust discussion around have they, in fact, reached monopoly status, but we don't treat them as monopolies because they have such adulation and so much affection from the populace that they're able to play by different rules. I think we need to ask, what does it mean when one company has more access to capital and its competitors that are medium or small competitors, because it has a fanatical investor base that doesn't demand profitability? So we have a series of tough discussions coming. Should a company get to $500 billion in value and pay no taxes? Should these companies play by a different rule set? Are they monopolies that aren't treated as monopoly? And given how efficient they are and how much capital and how much money they spread across a few households, is that good for society? We could all very easily end up in a world where we have very powerful phones, amazing content to watch on TV. We can get paper towels for less than we could 40 years ago, but many of us will be sitting on a couch without jobs.
It's going to be an interesting world going forward, that's for sure. Scott, the book, The Four, or How to Build a $1 Trillion Company, you get very granular in this, and I implore people to check the book out and to check you out on YouTube too, because I think the combination of the book and YouTube really works well together.
Oh, thank you.
Hey, where's the best place we can send people to check you out? Amazon for the book, of course. Whatever bookstores are going to be left. I guess Amazon bookstore is coming soon. But where is the best website we can send to people to check you out?
So I have a YouTube channel. If you type Scott Galloway into YouTube, you will get some videos that expand on these views. And I work for a company called L2. And so the website there is www.L as in Larry, the number 2, and then inc.com.
And also your Stern page as well.
Yeah, that's just my bio. But if you type in my name into Google, the first thing you'll get is my Stern bio page. But if you want to see some lectures, you want to see some talks, go to the YouTube channel.
Scott, I appreciate you taking some time early on the West Coast, it sounds like. Thank you very much.
I appreciate your time. Congratulations on the show.
Coming in at number 2, Jeffrey Tucker. I don't talk about it all the time on this show, but I personally love the word liberty. Liberty to me is politics, is economics. Without liberty, nothing else matters. My guest today, I have a sneaky suspicion, shares my feelings. Jeffrey Tucker is an American economics writer of the Austrian school. He's an advocate of anarcho-capitalism and Bitcoin, a publisher of many libertarian books. And many years ago, he helped to promote my first film, which came at economics from a libertarian perspective. Look, it only takes you a few searches, a few Google searches, and you will find out that Jeff is prolific as you know what. Jeff's the type of guest that I really do think if I could have on almost every week, maybe Jeff would get bored and I would get bored, but he's the type of guy that you can tell I can just go down the rabbit hole with. A curious guy who's well-read, well-written, and works at it like crazy. We can all be so fortunate to pick up a few gems, a few morsels of intellectual grist to help us push forward. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, primarily about liberty, with Jeffrey Tucker. So Jeff, this piece of writing of yours, I just love. This is dated December 13th, 2012. I'm reading the conclusion. Just give me a minute here. Every act of entrepreneurship is revolutionary and rooted in the anarchist spirit. It strikes at the heart of the status quo. It dares to be dissatisfied with what is. It imagines something new and better. It brings about the unexpected, unapproved, and progressive change by adding a new dimension of experience to how we understand ourselves and how we interact with others. Without entrepreneurship, history would lack forward motion. Our understanding of the uniqueness of our time in this world would forever be undefined, and society itself would atrophy and finally die. With it, every attempt to control and freeze the world faces opposition and long-run failure. History teaches that those who dare to stand in the way of human progress will eventually be run over. Yes, there is plenty of friction and too many victims as we get from here to there, but we will get there, one creative act of disobedience at a time. End quote. I love that piece of writing. You're probably going to tell me, Mike, you could find that all over my world, but I love that piece.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fun to listen to.
I've not read that before. No practice, and so
yeah, that works. It works. Yeah, that
so
works.
listen, let's speak to that for a second, because if I think back over the last, oh my gosh, to the 1990s, a George Bush administration, a Clinton administration, another Bush administration, an Obama administration, now a Trump administration. But what I just read, that opening from you, that's timeless. It doesn't make a difference, the administration, does it?
No, the regimes come and go. But there's something about technology, the methods we use, and the way we learn, the information we share with each other, that cuts through and dominates and becomes the theme of history, which goes against everything we're taught, right? I think we're mostly taught that history is shaped by the leaders of society. And I'm just increasingly convinced that that is really not true. History is shaped by the tools we use, the spirit we have, the faith that we exercise, and the conduct of our daily interactions with each other. This is really what shapes history, not these fools that claim to rule us. In a funny way, I think that everybody is too either afraid of or celebratory of political leaders. I just don't think they matter that much.
It's a great point. And I think for Americans that don't know, I wish, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I know you spent a lot of time around that area too. I think for people to truly understand that the folks in Washington, D.C., they're not there to necessarily do anything except get elected. I mean, their whole process is about getting elected because they derive this feeling of power from kind of lording over folks. And it's kind of the exact opposite of what people think those people do when they go there.
Yeah, well, and then you get elected and you have to get reelected. It's their job, and that's what they're good at. People get good at what they do, whatever it is. Politicians run for office. That's what they're good at, and that's their specialty. It's their main thing that they do well, and they serve the constituents well. Especially state legislators and House of Representatives members and members of Congress and Senate. They serve their constituents and their voters, and that's it. That's what they specialize in. But they are not visionaries. They cannot run the world. They're not defining history. I think increasingly we know this. Actually, I was thinking about this the other day. I'd love to read history and sort of throw myself into the mindset of the 1960s, where everybody was enthusiastic about sort of public housing or school reform, or back in the 1930s when people thought that you just had to build a bunch of dams and bridges and roads and things that would cause the economy to recover, or 15 years earlier, people believed that all you had to do to get rid of liquor consumption and production in this country was pass. It's really difficult to recreate those times in your mind. I don't think we have anywhere near the faith in government that previous generations had at all. I mean, I live in Atlanta. The government doesn't really try anymore, and that's a good thing. I think it's good. Governments are out of money. That's my evaluation of our present moment.
Since we've kind of talked, or I've opened up with this kind of entrepreneurial anarchist spirit, this great intro from you, I know something near and dear to you, and this really gets at a lot of different issues, which is Bitcoin, the cryptocurrencies, blockchain. Why don't you give from your perspective? I mean, this is something relatively new, but you've been writing about it for years. Why don't you give for the uninitiated? Because look, Bitcoin becomes a lot more interesting when it's gone from 200 to 4,000 in a few years. But why don't you give for the audience out there, from your perspective, why Bitcoin is so important to you?
Bitcoin was important to me because I've been studying monetary theory since I was, undergraduate. I wrote my undergraduate thesis, on the gold standard. I felt like I knew everything about monetary theory, its history. I've written books on the topic. I thought I read everything. And I thought I had it all figured out. And so when Bitcoin came along, and somebody I guess I first heard about it in 2009, I just dismissed it because I knew better. I thought money could not be made this way, that there was something about the digital world that would make it impossible. I mean, it's implausible. Well, some dude writes an algorithm and you can plug your computer in and make money, and people are going to, none of it made any sense to me. And so, so a few years later, I finally just had to confront, the evidence of my senses. Bitcoin was clearly working, and I realized I had to kind of bury my own a priori theorizing. I had to get humble in the face of the market. I had to look out the window instead of just sitting staring at books, I had to actually pay attention to what was going on. And studying Bitcoin helped me not only just advance my knowledge in a series of areas like cryptography and the potential for digital networks and ledgers and that sort of thing, but mostly what it did is it humbled me as an intellectual to realize that the market and entrepreneurship can know more than any intellectual can know. And after that, after I discovered this, yeah, I've approached the world of ideas slightly differently. You know, I like to think that I'm a little more deferential to the results of the market, a little more willing to watch the unfolding of history rather than pretend to prescribe exactly what should happen, you know, to defer to what is rather than sit around wishing what were. And it just taught me a very valuable lesson. It opened up the work of F.A. Hayek to me in a way that I had never understood it before. I had been reading Hayek for 20 years, but Bitcoin kind of gave me a new way to understand Hayek.
Bring the audience into your perspective there so they can, I know we could go off for a very long tangent here, but bring them into your understanding and let them follow along.
I knew that Hayek had written a lot about the knowledge that's essential, the things that we have to know as a society in order to make our society work. There has to be a ton of things you know about basically everything: technological processes, consumer demand, availability of resources relative to demands of time. You have to know mores and manners and contractual conventions. There's so much knowledge. There's actually an infinite amount of knowledge that you have to have in order to sort of cause the social order to function. Now, I had read Hayek say this in the past. I didn't really understand what it meant, right? But after Bitcoin, you know, I began to realize that, you know, one of the ways that Bitcoin works is that it's decentralized, and that's its most sort of prescient feature, is that it's a decentralized ledger application that can be owned by an infinite number of nodes. So you've got the knowledge that's necessary to make Bitcoin work is sort of embedded in millions of different places, you know, and Bitcoin itself is a sort of it's a cumulative technology that puts together basically 5 different disciplines and shoves them all into a single sort of unit. And when you look at the extent of the complexity and just how many decades, really centuries or millennia it took to lead up to this point, you begin to kind of get a sense of what Hayek's saying, that the only real way that society can organize itself is local knowledge of time and place embedded in every single individual human mind and its capacity for working with others. It's the only way society can work, is through freedom, in other words, right? You can't have a central plan that is able to do anything remotely like this. And that's sort of the beauty of Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin came about not because the Federal Reserve created it, or the Department of Treasury, or any academic at MIT or anywhere else. It didn't appear in a scholarly journal. It was a decentralized application that was released on an email listserv, you know, by an anonymous programmer or 2 or 3. That is just amazing if you think about it. And now it's changing the world.
Okay, so I'd be amiss if I didn't pick your speculations, so to speak. So as you look at Bitcoin unfold, you've got these many decades of studying monetary theory. Give me a projection. Give me a way that you could see Bitcoin unfolding in a way where state power decreases.
One thing that's glorious about Bitcoin is it's an international currency, which is harder as Americans for us to wrap our brains around. I mean, Bitcoin spends the same anywhere in the world, you know, which I didn't get. I remember a few years ago I was in New Zealand and I wanted to take a helicopter ride and they accepted Bitcoin. And I thought, oh, good heavens, I've got to figure out the exchange rate. So I converted Bitcoin so I said, what's the New Zealand dollar exchange rate with Bitcoin? They told me. And so I said, okay, great. And so then I went to the exchange rate and converted New Zealand dollars to American dollars. and then American dollars back into Bitcoin. And then I realized, oh, wait, it's exactly the same price. Do you understand? So I didn't really... It was like at that moment I realized, oh, this is a global currency. So that by itself makes it more useful than any national money. And the odd thing about Bitcoin is it's kind of what they say, the word that people use is deflationary. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. In other words, it rises in value all the time. So there's an incentive. It increases in value relative. I mean, not all the time, but, just generally over time it does. And so there's an incentive to save it because you actually make money by not spending. So, can you imagine the effect that will have on sort of frugality and capital accumulation? It's got the potential to make us immensely wealthy, not just as individuals, but as a society. And the important thing is that central banks cannot control it under any circumstances. Now, some listeners out there going, oh, sure, until they decide to abolish it. But, the important thing to remember is that the ecosphere of the crypto asset world is essentially invulnerable to any manner of control. The only thing that governments can really control is the coming and going, into and out of that ecosphere, that infrastructure of the crypto asset world, the blockchain ledgers. They can control your capacity to get in or get out, but once you're in it, you're free. I think what this does is incentivizes everybody to get in and stay in, and that's increasingly why we're seeing the exchange rate go the way it is. And it's just so we understand. There's something I would really like to say about this to explain, because I really haven't gone into it yet.
The floor is yours.
Okay. We really need to understand that Bitcoin is in a funny way. It's an application, but if you only think about Bitcoin, you really are missing the important thing. What's critical here is the underlying technology, which is called in the Bitcoin world the blockchain, or which is actually more properly called a distributed ledger. Now, immediately your listeners are going, oh, well, this is really boring. Wait a minute. We have to go back in history and understand that there are two really critical stages to making prosperity happen. One is the invention of private property. Like, people have to figure out that private property is better than just beating each other up and grabbing things from each other. I'll recognize your rights, you recognize my rights. That's a really important first step to getting life civilized. The second really important step is often neglected, which is you have to have a technology to document these ownership claims so that they can be traded over time and people can develop peaceful expectations of what the claims of others are. So no matter where you look at in all of history, you'll find some technology for documenting ownership rights. Initially it was stones, and then it was clay, and then later vellum, and then later parchment. Not vellum, vellum came after parchment. Papyrus, and then parchment. But by the time you get to the Medicis, you've got this beautiful, beautiful sort of shaved sheepskin called vellum, that the Medicis were able to record their accounts on. And that's what gave rise to capitalism in Europe. I mean, we're talking about the 15th, 16th century. Without that technology of recording ownership claims and debts and payments and just to document stuff, capitalism never would have taken off. Actually, feudalism would have never come to an end. So that's a very interesting way to think about it. Okay, let's just bump up now to the 1970s. We developed some really sophisticated technologies and databasing, within the course of our lifetimes, and that was just fantastic. The problem with all database technology is it's kind of lagged behind the sophistication of our financial instruments. And that's essentially what happened in 2008. We had some really sophisticated financial instruments that are out there being traded, all sorts of derivatives of MBS products and everything else. We didn't have the technology to keep up with ownership claims. So when the whole thing went belly up, there was a massive scramble to find out that basic thing. Who owns what? And we still never really figured that out. Actually, the Fed had to buy a bunch of this junk, right? Because they couldn't figure out competing claims. So the blockchain comes out in 2009 as a technology to finally solve this problem that has vexed humanity since the ancient world. The problem with all previous technologies of documenting ownership claims is that they were always centralized. There's always some dude in charge, some one family in charge, a company in charge, a government in charge, a bureaucracy in charge. Suddenly in 2009, we found a way to put this ledger of ownership claims into a distributed cloud that all of humanity can simultaneously watch and keep an eye on. And that's what the blockchain does. So there's no longer a central point of failure for the technology that is so essential to making our lives good. So you understand then that Bitcoin is only one sort of application of this ledger technology. It's not, the most important thing is that there's so many other applications. And so if you think about it, like, history will never be the same because we know what the blockchain looks like. We know what it can do. From now on, it's just a matter of figuring out ever better ways to go about using it.
I like an attitude that I've seen you express about Bitcoin, and essentially, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit here, but you've kind of said, look, this, and you obviously know exactly the details as you just outlined, but you've kind of said, look, the young people have really taken this and they're running with it. And let's don't discount where they're running with it and how hard they're running. However, there are some very wise people, names that you probably know. Mark Spitznagel, for one, a fund manager. He has come out and pretty much said, hey, this just doesn't really have a chance to work. And again, I'm paraphrasing on him. And he essentially says that because government will step in at some point in time. Another fund manager, a guy named Howard Marks, who writes great. Howard has come out and basically said, it's just these young millennials after the Great Recession and they don't know what they're doing and this is all just going to implode. And there might be massive ups and downs. That happens, like the railways or something like that. But as you've just outlined, there is something significant here beyond the probably future booms and busts that will come within this technology.
Oh, sure. And I get, it's actually amusing. One of the funny things about being involved with the sector is that you see the same waves of opinion over and over again. I remember when Bitcoin went from, 11 to $30 pretty quickly and then crashed down to $14. Everybody said, look, see, that's just proof this thing was a bubble. And, if you got in at 30, you lost your shirt, people were furious, and then the same thing happened, when it went from 80 back down to, 25, and then when it went up to 180 and fell to 90 and so on. And so there's just successive waves of hysteria. And every time people say, well, Bitcoin is dead, And yeah, it's going to be subject to this kind of stuff. And the enthusiasm that young people show for it is really funny and really amusing, and a lot of people make bad decisions. I had a good friend of mine, you can tell this just a few years ago, who bought in because when people want to buy, it's because they, there's some reason, or it's on the news, it's it's the talk of the town, they kind of get swept up in the ethos and have some sense that like they're being left behind. So they rush into the market, of course, inevitably buying at the high, right? So I had a friend who bought in at 1,020, and he was mad at me because I think after that it collapsed down to 650 or something, and he said, "I can't believe I'm poor, and because of you, I bought in at this very high point." And I said, "Listen, buddy, I never told you to buy, I don't tell people when to buy and when to sell. I mean, if I had that kind of knowledge, I would just keep it to myself and be a billionaire already, So I'm very careful about that. But the funny thing is that he was really upset with me for a long time, as long as it stayed at that level. And I haven't talked to him since because it turns out, of course, that buying in at 1,020 was a fantastic decision, actually. So, his investment is quadrupled in the meantime. So that's some pretty good returns. But he didn't know that at the time. So it's really interesting to kind of watch these waves of hysteria. And the thing about being a really good Bitcoiner or crypto enthusiast in general is that you just can't you can't get emotional about it. You just got to watch it. And nowadays, it's pretty interesting. People have these accounts at these exchanges, Poloniex and BitREx and Kraken and these places. They rebalance their portfolios in a very interesting way. You know, they'll buy the newest crypto thing. They'll read the white paper and buy it. And most of the kids that are involved in the stuff they understand that most of these things are going to lose, but some of them are going to win. You know, so you buy Dash, you buy Neo, you get Ethereum Classic. There's a fork in the Ethereum platform, so you get your regular Ethereum or Ethereum Classic, and then we saw a fork the other day in Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. That was a funny one because all existing owners of Bitcoin, because of the fork, actually became owners of Bitcoin Cash if you had the sophistication to get it. Well, a lot of people went to the trouble of getting it, and Bitcoin Cash kind of languished, at like $200 for a while, and people figured, well, that's not going anywhere. And then just over the course of 3 days, shot up to $700 or $800, and so suddenly all Bitcoin Cash owners were rich. Anybody who sold the thing, was kicking themselves. So there's an adventure to the whole thing, and it's fun, and I get it. Young people are way more interested in this than they are going to their Merrill Lynch broker and saying, "Oh, let me buy, a balanced portfolio of Fortune 500 companies," which is really dull, and you can't make a lot of money. You can't beat the trading models of these big firms. But in the crypto markets, you still have a chance for real profits, real excitement, real honest to goodness market-based drama. Do you see what I mean? It's just fun, and people are aware of what they're getting into. I was over at the UPS store the other day mailing a package, and I was using my Bitcoin credit card, and the guy said, "Oh wow, Bitcoin, huh?" And he told me, he said, "I bought Neo, when it was $1, and now it's $100." And I said, "Wait, you're a Neo investor?" He said, "Oh sure, I've got a whole portfolio of crypto assets." And so we just began to kind of jabber on about this stuff, and this is just some dude, you know what I mean? So
we're already, I haven't used the term yet, but we're already in the field of, quote, liberty. I don't think there could be a word that's more dear to you than the word liberty. As we speak about cryptocurrencies, what I find interesting is so many young people today reaching for this great technology, speculating like crazy, assembling these portfolios of digital currencies. There's got to be booms and busts. That's the way it goes. But on the flip side, I see, and you're a man in your early 50s, I'm in my late 40s. I believe we both went to the same university, George Mason, and which has got a really interesting perspective for people that don't know. George Mason takes a very liberty perspective on things, but what I'm getting a little bit confused about with younger people today, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but I'm seeing this desire on one hand to go this direction that you and I both just go, wow, I love it, run hard. But then on the other side, there is a certain number of a certain population of younger people that are reaching for state power to go beyond what you and I would have otherwise thought was a limit on something like speech, where there's it's this weird conundrum that I don't get. Why don't you speak to where we are today on that side of the coin?
Yeah, well, you've got, Bernie made sort of leftism fashionable again, partially, Bernie Sanders, partially because he was promising to forgive all the student debts. I think student debt has served as a real source of intellectual corruption for an entire generation. And I get it, right? I mean, these people are told for their whole lives, the goal in life is to get to college and then you'll be well taken care of. And they spend $250,000. They ended up with, maybe, $80,000 to $100,000 in debt, and they get their college degree and they get out there in the job marketplace. And the only thing the prospective employers want to know is what experience do you have and what knowledge and what skills do you have? And they're like, well, wait, that's not the purpose of college. I have this degree. I mean, what's the problem? And they're like, well, we're kind of looking for experience and skills. Well, nobody told them that. So they feel ripped off and robbed, and now they're saddled with immense debt while they're working as baristas at Starbucks. Okay, so they're mad at the world, they're mad at the culture, and they want their debts paid by others. I totally get it.
You know, sometimes modern technology just disappoints me. Jeff and I got dropped there, and it's not because we happen to be 9,000 miles away from each other for this conversation. Just one of those fluke things. Let me get back to Jeff Tucker.
You know, I grew up in Lubbock, Texas, so that if I was driving to Houston, my mother would say, "Hey, listen, when you're in Houston, can you call your aunt, Sally, and let her know that, that I love her and that you're in town. You don't have to see her, just give her a call." And the reason was we had to pay so-called long distance.
What's long distance now?
We don't even know what that means.
Hey, that gets to your point, though. One of the interesting things in the article that I first quoted in the beginning of this call was talking about an innovation where Google basically said, hey, here's YouTube. Then all of a sudden, everyone put pirated material up. Then Google was served with cease and desist. And then they came up with a solution that got around. Why don't you talk about that solution? That was actually the point of that article.
Well, this is one of the most extraordinary things that's happened actually in the 21st century is the sort of the ever more refinement that's taken place in IP rights to basically get rid of the old walls that were erected between creative media. Recognize the fact that the internet is a giant copy machine. That's what it does best. That's what it specializes in. Yeah, there's been a lot of really interesting entrepreneurial innovations to find out ways in which we can share, but commoditize the interest of users in a way that turns into profitability. So in other words, instead of using force and takedown notices and bludgeons and clubs to beat each other up, you stole my stuff, you stole my stuff. Let's incentivize each other to share material, and then we can be better off with both of us doing that. And then push out advertising. I mean, basically what we're getting to is a really wonderful situation in which just the very fact of our human interest, our eyeballs, the time that we spend looking at something is being commoditized and monetized for us online. And that is just absolutely glorious.
One of the things that was really cool in that article, and I'll probably put the link to this article in the write-up, but the idea that, look, if you create something, whether it's writing or music or whatnot, look, if there's no eyeballs, it becomes useless because no one's listening, no one's reading, whatever. But if you have fans that want to promote it, and now through the use of technology, Google's a great example, and YouTube, it lets everyone share in something that otherwise would have been obscure and not generating any revenue.
You have to get attention in today's economy. It's always been true, right? It just doesn't matter how many widgets you make at home. If you can't market them and get people caring about them and get them out there, you're never going to make a dime. And it's that way in the information economy too. Your main goal is to get out there and earn people's attention. And it's a really rivalrous world out there. I mean, Fee.org fights for attention every single day. And how do we fight for that attention? We strive to publish ever better material, to serve people ever better, to do things that are ever more compelling. And what's nice about that is that there is no one formula. There's no one way forward because tastes are always changing. The competition's always changing. Rivalry is very intense. We think of every article we publish as basically opening a business, and we try to package it in a way that serves the customer. It's the only way you can earn attention these days, essentially by serving each other ever better. That's the kind of world we live in, and I love it. I think it's really exciting. Other people look at that and go, "That's terrible. That's too much work. That's too much trouble." I just don't think it is. I think it's where we want to be as a society. We want to live in a world we're incentivized as much as possible to be productive, peaceful, and valuable to each other, ever more recognizing people's rights and what they can contribute to us and what we can contribute them in a kind of a big enterprise to get mutually wealthy, so we can have better lives.
That dovetails right back to when we lost our call to that technology breakdown. You were kind of going down the path of explaining how so many young people have bought into the idea of, hey, get the college degree, and then they get out, and then all of a sudden, hold on, it's not worth as much.
Well, it's so sad.
Right,
so
right.
Sad.
And before we broke off, I was thinking, and while we were delayed, I was thinking, it's not just the young people, because if you're 16, 17 years of age, and I'm looking at a sister with 3 teenagers coming along now, all going to be facing school choices. But if the parents don't think this through as well, I mean, look, 30 years ago, you weren't spending this much money for school. So now the parents, seem to me, are driving so much of this because they want their kids to have this degree. And the parents don't get the very things that you're talking about on this podcast right now today as the most important.
No, here's the problem. Parents are extremely risk averse. Parents, they have kids, they're looking at the kids. Their initial thought is this is the most awesome, glorious creature in the history of humankind, right? That lasts until they're about 3. And then you're kind of like, wow, this kid kind of is misbehaving and sort of not exactly what I expected, right? So you follow your kid from the ages of 3 until 20 wondering, yeah, can this kid really make it? I want the best for him or her, but I'm just not really sure. And for a lot of parents, they push this education thing and this degree thing as a way of kind of guaranteeing their success. The problem is that a degree is ever less valuable out in the real marketplace. I mean, here in Atlanta, I know a lot of kids that are just killing it out there in the software industry and software sales and all kinds of professions related to digital entrepreneurship and that sort of thing. A lot of them didn't go to college or dropped out of college. Some of the most successful young people I know in Atlanta actually dropped out of high school in order to pursue these kind of professions, and they're doing really, really well. Meanwhile, you've got a lot of universities around here that are just filled up with kids that are spending $250,000, 4 years of their lives studying stuff they're never going to use, during which time they're not actually working. Because, when I was in school, you could work and pay your way through school. Now that is futile. So you don't even have the incentive to work while you're in college. And forget working before college. I mean, under the American laws, which are increasingly intensely enforced, you can't even really get a real job until you're like 17, by which time you don't even care about it anymore. Kids aren't getting commercial experience. By the way, I'm really passionate about this topic of youth unemployment and employment, and I blame the government for the large part of it. You've got compulsory schooling. You've also got these child labor laws, which date from the New Deal, which do not need to be there. We've got to come up with better ways to mix it up a little bit, a little school, a little work. And as far as I'm concerned, you could do this from the age of 11 or 12, and I think it would just benefit people immensely. I think right now these child labor laws are actually violating human rights. It's just wrong that a 14-year-old kid,
it opens up the minimum wage as well.
Oh, and the minimum wage too. I'm headed in early November. I've been invited to Yale University to make an argument for the political union concerning this topic of child labor. I don't know anybody else who's writing about it besides me, but I think it's so enormously important. It just doesn't make sense what we do between the minimum wage and the child labor laws and compulsory schooling laws. We're ruining the lives of these young people, and then they're graduating from college with immense amounts of debt, are very frustrated in their professions, live in an environment of 1 or 2% economic growth, where they're still dependent upon their parents. They're starting to get angry. They're looking for scapegoats, and no surprise, it ends up spilling out into the streets with these idiotic political dramas we're seeing in places like Charlottesville and Boston.
Let me stay there for a second with you. As a guy who loves the word liberty, loves liberty, it's got to be difficult to look at modern day society with so many people Instead of like, you and I are having this conversation about ideas, concepts, things we can imagine, the creative process. To me, in every relationship I have, I want it to start there. But certain very large segments of the population are now saying, no, before we start talking, recognize the color of my skin, recognize my gender, my sex, recognize my religion. I've literally seen in the last few weeks people that have told me flat out, hey, check yourself. We've got to start with these identity issues before we can get to reason. My brain can't compute the identity stuff. I can only stay in reason. I can't go to the identity thing.
Well, and I tell you, there's nothing that makes people angrier than if you look at them and say, I would recognize what your opinion is. I would recognize your rights and the legitimacy of what you say and your value of a human being, except for the fact that you're white, you're black, you're a woman, you're a man,
you're straight, you're gay, whatever.
You're straight, you're gay, you're a Christian, you're a Muslim. You start attacking things about people that are at the core of who they are and disregarding their humanity. And I'm telling you, it happens from the left and it happens from the right.
What do people really want with this identity stuff? What is the real, isn't the real desire? They just want respect and they don't know how to get it?
I tend to think it's more ideological than that. I mean, I think that's part of it. But it's also this conception of the world that there's a fixed pie and I'm going to get mine. If I'm not getting what I feel like I need, it's probably your fault. Let's face it, academia has been promoting this message now for a very, very long time. I mean, colleges get class after class after class. It's identity politics. It's, there's no economic understanding, in literature class and politics and sociology and even psychology classes. I mean, the stuff they're preaching, the class conflict, the race conflict, the religious conflict. There's all these conflict ideologies. It's kind of, even though we don't live this way in real life, academia is just packed with people who think only in terms of this. And this is the nonsense that's being drilled into kids' heads. And I'm not sure that they really have an alternative model to really think about the world. I mean, we just got a huge educational job ahead of us. An educational job, and also I think we have a political job to do, not in the sense of like, oh, let's elect a right-wing guy to crush the left-wing guy or vice versa, but rather let's just diminish the role of government entirely in people's lives, get rid of the crushing taxation that's causing business to be restrained in its willingness to expand and hire, and kick up economic growth to 3, 4, 5%. And I think you changed the topic entirely.
As you say that, there could be people listening that maybe they might assume, oh my gosh, that sounds like a very right-leaning thing, reduce the taxes. But then my counter argument would be, well, hold on. We all know that Apple, which is a company, I use their products every day. I love their products, but Apple has a very distinct political ideology. But what's so interesting about Apple is they park literally hundreds of billions of dollars in Ireland to avoid taxes. So it's just this, there's the headlines and then there's the reality of what people do.
It's absolutely crazy. I mean, if you have amazing, successful company like Apple, there should be every reason to expand and expand and expand in the most economically efficient way, and not taking these circuitous routes to hide your surpluses and funny little tax schemes all over the world. None of it makes any sense.
But it does make sense given the current tax laws.
Oh, it definitely does. When I think about the Trump administration, I think it's just it's just been one huge calamity. And I really 2 years ago was writing against the sort of the ethos that he represents. What was fascinating to me is as you approached the general election, Trump started getting better at his messaging. Instead of anti-immigration and mercantilism and let's spend a lot of money on infrastructure and everything, he started talking about real stuff like we've got a problem in the healthcare sector, we got to get rid of Obamacare. But he started talking about tax cuts, and it was great, and that really kind of put him over the top. But you look at the way things have unfolded in real time in the last 6 months. He tried to tweet his way towards healthcare reform, that basically otherwise did nothing, and attacked the House when they came up with one decent proposal for half a day. So that he dropped the ball on that. It's just been a disaster. His tax cut proposal, which is mostly pushed by the Treasury Department because he's got some good people over there, was wonderful. I mean, cutting the cap gains tax and the corporate rate of tax.
Why has cap gains not been cut already? I don't get it.
We have one of the highest rates in the world, and it'd just be the most important thing if you could just slash corporate income taxes by a third and capital gains taxes by a third and get us on par with Canada and other countries around the world. You would inspire just such surprising and interesting and unpredictable levels of investment, growth, and business expansion in this country. I mean, you know, wherever you sit, if you live in the United States, just think of a business within the square mile from where you live, and imagine what they could do if they could pay a third less in corporate income taxes, or if capital gains taxes were far lower and profitable investments were not punished. I mean, what would that do to economic growth? I think it would just be, it would be spectacular. Actually.
The counter argument would be, though, that the people that have that extra benefit will just hold on to it themselves and go on vacations and just be more personally rich.
Oh, it's just you know, the chance to make more money, you know, is something that's the most awesome thing. That's what all business people, entrepreneurs are looking for. But they're not going to be doing that as long as they feel it's going to be punished, or that the risk is too high. If they're barely making it as it is, they get really risk averse and they hunker down. And they're happy with the profits they have. Something has got to happen. I think that's actually more important from a macroeconomic point of view than cutting individual income taxes, which I think that would be nice. Payroll tax cuts would be glorious, but that's like stage 2. We've got to at least get to the first step. And you notice that's completely off the table now.
I have no confidence in any of this, Jeff. It's not going to happen.
I know. It's just it's so tragic to me. I find it just this gigantic missed opportunity, and I'm pulling my hair out. Apparently, there are other people in the White House that are too. So we're hardly alone in this. But it is tremendously sad to see the squandering of political capital on these idiotic causes. I mean, I think tonight we're going to get a speech from our president about how we're going to send another 4,000 troops to Afghanistan. 16-year-long war that is absolutely unwinnable. I grew up in the midst of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and as a kid, I remember you thinking, well, that is one stupid government if they think they're going to be able to do anything in Afghanistan.
Those folks know how to survive. They know how to fight. It's never going to be won.
No, it'll never be won. I spent a lot of time talking to people who've done several tours over there, high-level consultants, security officials, and regular troops. And what the U.S. has done to that country is just such an unbelievable mess. And there is no clean answer. But everybody I've talked to says that, as messy and terrible as that could be, a pullout is really the only answer. And the Soviets understood that at some point, and the U.S. is going to come to terms with it too. But I don't know, governments are not good at admitting, okay, this war was silly. It's not working. We in fact don't know how to make Afghanistan a better place, and we suck at that, and we're just going to move on. Governments are terrible at admitting that sort of thing.
In our little bit of time we have left, I want to take you to an issue that we were kind of going down the path of. That is the free flow of speech and information. Look, we all know about the Great Firewall in China. I thoroughly enjoy going to mainland China, but I don't thoroughly enjoy not being able to access anything when I go there. They've done a fantastic job for their country of bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. To probably every economist in the 70s would have said, no way this is going to work. Well, it's worked in a crazy way so far. But, I really don't like the stoppage of information flow that I see in China. I don't like the directions that I see in America where people want to stop speech. I mean, the whole idea of hate speech is, well, if you can't have hate speech, then you don't have free speech. And I mention China, I mention US, but there are many other countries around the world, countries that people would not otherwise expect. I'm not going to name names right now, that I know these countries are blocking websites, blocking this, blocking that. They don't advertise it. They don't tell people they're doing it, but it's painfully obvious. And these are westernized type countries. You know, I still remember when Netscape went public in the summer of 1995. I really hope all that optimism that started right then, August of 1995, I really hope we're not going to end up building a bunch of walls, digital walls, all around us in the next 10 years, and then we're going to wake up and it's all going to be gone.
Well, listen, we're going to try. I mean, that's one of the great tragedies. We're going to try to do that. It's not going to last. Over time, the walls are going to come down. 50 years from now, these debates we're having today will seem just ridiculous. And my concern is that, one or two generations hence, people are going to look back and go, what were those people thinking in the early part of the 21st century?
They weren't thinking.
That thought they could control information. Don't they know? Didn't they know that information just wants to be free? I mean, they're holding back progress of humanity with all the censorship and the imposition of IP laws and the prosecution of people for trying to create things and the harassment of business. There's a great blockchain innovation and all the Treasury Department did try to do which was trying to make it operate like the old technology that is trying to replace. We're just doing so many dumb things right now, and it is embarrassing from a historical sweep of civilization point of view. Again, government cannot win this struggle. They will certainly lose. But in the meantime, they can slow us down in ways that we're missing so much potential in it, and it's just enormously tragic. That's the great thing about you look at a history of innovation. A good idea comes along, it's going to eventually prevail. And everything and everybody who tries to stand in the way is going to get mowed down, eventually. But it comes at a terrible, terrible cost. Blockchain right now is, I think, the single most exciting thing that's happened in my lifetime from a technological point of view, maybe in the last century, maybe ever. I'm so enormously excited about it. I mean, just the possibility of anybody to be able to float an idea out there, float an idea for some great new human service they want, tokenize it, raise capital just simply online from regular people.
Have you seen where the blockchain being proposed? I'm sure you have. You're more well read at this than me, but blockchain being used for property rights in places like Brazil with the favelas where people don't really know ownership, and this ability to go in, post and solve some of the real estate squabbles. There's just so many different benefits.
I'm an advisor to a company called Factum that issues a token called the Factoid. They are registering property all over the Dominican Republic and other Latin American countries right now. And the reason for this is that these property owners need some documentation that they can present, when thugs come along. Yeah, to get loans, and when thugs come along and try to mix things up with them and say, hey, I think you shouldn't have this. And it's like, no, here it is. And so this company is doing very well, hard at work using blockchain technology to register property. And there's smart contracting going on all the time. The Ethereum platform that was invented just a few years ago has tens of thousands of applications floating on it that are smart contracts that, automatically fire up and you lay out your conditions and terms. If they're fulfilled, they're paid. If they're not, they're not. I mean, it's just, like we began this interview with some discussion of what it means to document your ownership claims. It means everything. It means a more peaceful world, essentially.
What does it mean for the nation state, though, Jeff?
Well, the nation state relies on two things. One is particular contained geographic jurisdiction. And the second thing is that it's very good at controlling the physical world. So blockchain technology removes both those conditions. It's a digital technology that flows, doesn't care anything about borders. It's weightless and takes no space. So from the point of view of the nation state, I think ultimately it means the death of what we call a nation state today, or at least its decline to purely symbolic importance. I think that's where we're headed. When? I don't know. History is moving very, very quickly. When I look back at technologies like internal combustion or steel or railroads or flight or electricity, the amount of time it took to get from invention to middle-class consumer application was very, very long in every one of those cases. But blockchain technology is moving very, very quickly. Like I say, when I can just, show up at the UPS store and find the guy behind the counter investing his earnings in companies all over the world, without asking anybody's permission, and become really well versed in it. I think you've got something really exciting going on, something that can ultimately destroy many sources of oppression and despotism in our world today.
I love the idea of not asking for permission, right? That's so much of the essence of it all. Hey, Jeff, I would pick your mind all day. I can't. Where can there's besides Amazon, they can go to Amazon, they can buy Jeff Tucker books, Upside and Down.
Yeah, I've got so many books. I've got a new book coming out, by the way. I hope to finish it. There's an economist, a very brilliant economist named Deirdre McCloskey, who's writing the introduction to my next book. It should be out September 1st. It's called Right-Wing Collectivism, The Other Threat to Liberty.
Please get me a copy. We'll have to do another call.
Oh, I'd like to. And then I've got, I guess 7 other books.
What's the best website for you? Is the best that people can go check your writing out?
Yeah, that's fee.org. I write every single day.
But you know how this writing stuff goes. I'm at 5 books, but I don't write. When I read your writing, I know how much time you've put in. I mean, I can write a book, okay, but I can read some other people's writing and I realize how much more time they put in. And I really appreciate the craft of your writing. I mean, when you read something like I did at the beginning of this podcast, it just makes me excited. Maybe it doesn't make other people excited. Maybe they're boring or whatever. But those 3 paragraphs I read at the beginning of this call, those things should be tattooed on the walls of our chest or our house or whatever. That's life.
Thank you so much for saying that. I really appreciate it. I do work very hard at it, but I have to say I'm never satisfied. People ask me, what's my favorite thing I've written? And I always tell them it's the thing I'm going to write tomorrow.
Only as good as what the last word put down on the piece of paper.
That's right.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, I appreciate your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Now, coming in at number 3, Brian Christian. So this great book came across my desk, Algorithms to Live By, The Computer Science of Human Decisions. Let me give a brief overview from the website. A fascinating exploration of how computer algorithms can be applied to our everyday lives, helping to solve common decision-making problems and illuminate the workings of the human mind. All our lives are constrained by limited space and time, limits that give rise to a particular set of problems. What should we do or leave undone in a day or a lifetime? How much messiness should we accept? What balance of new activities and familiar favorites is the most fulfilling? These may seem like uniquely human quandaries, but they are not. Computers, too, face the same constraints. So computer scientists have been grappling with their version of such problems for decades, and the solutions they've found have much to teach us. Again, that is from the book Algorithms to Live By Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths. And my guest today is one of those authors, Brian Christian. Oh, and by the way, if you invest or if you are a trader, it's a must read. Now on to Brian Christian. How in the world did you even start to go down this path with your co-author? Really?
I've really been going down this path since my teenage years. When I was in college, I was a double major in computer science and philosophy. In some sense, each way of looking at the world started to permeate the other. And I began, thinking of computer science in philosophical terms, but also thinking about computer science as a way to approach the problems that I was facing in everyday life, the way that we would turn to a discipline like philosophy for advice on, the problems of the world, the things that we're grappling with. I actually found that computer science offered me, in many ways, an as compelling or more compelling framework, and really a vocabulary for kind of understanding the problems around me. And so, this is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time.
My background, having written several books on trading, I was just stunned to go through your work because, and I don't know if anyone said this to you yet, but if somebody is a trader, an investor in 2016, and they're serious about it, this is almost foundational, your work. Now, maybe that was not the intent, but in my world, so many of the quant traders, and I'm not talking about the high frequency stuff, but the kind of the longer term trend traders that have 100% automated strategies, all back tested, finding a positive mathematical expectation, understanding overfitting, understanding robustness, having it all automated. And to read your work, it's like, oh, wow, okay, whether intended or not, you guys just laid down the foundation for traders today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, that's not an area that I know especially deeply, but it's certainly, I'm certainly aware that we're kind of living in this time in which a lot of the decision making that's going on in the world, finance being a great example, is increasingly being, executed by algorithms. There's this increasing need to understand just some of the larger ideas and the real principles of the field of computer science as a way of kind of making sense of how these things operate. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring some of those principles back to our own decision-making processes in our own lives. And so that's really where I see this book coming in, is it kind of completes this feedback loop where for the last 50 or 60 years, algorithm designers have begun by asking themselves how they would solve a problem. And that's often, any programmer's first draft of a piece of code that they're writing. But of course, as the field has matured, we've developed this formal rigor around being able to make assertions and make proofs around optimality and expectation and bounds and so forth. What we haven't seen is bringing that knowledge back around to improve our own intuitions. And so that's where I see this book coming in as kind of completing that circuit.
Let's talk the word algorithm. For people that know, they'll hear your words, they'll read your work, and they'll be like, oh, okay, it makes perfect sense. But for a lot of people, I know the word algorithm immediately brings about fear and confusion. And why don't you give a little of a historical perspective? Because an algorithm is just really a way to take things that we could do as a human being on a piece of paper with a pencil and taking it to the land of computer science, to the land of computers. So why don't you give a little bit of a narrative there? Because it's not necessarily so complicated. I think sometimes it's the vocabulary that causes people to pause.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's a word that today we associate specifically with the world of computer science, but the principle of what makes an algorithm is it's really just a series of steps that you follow to solve a problem or make a decision. Algorithms in this sense are much older and much broader than the computer, of course. And we all in school learned, for example, algorithms for doing long division, or you subtract by carrying the one and so forth. But it goes back even farther than that. I mean, you can think of and cooking following a recipe as being algorithmic in that sense. And so mathematical procedures have been found on clay tablets dating back thousands of years. And so in many ways, they are not only older than the computer, but they are some of the first and oldest technology, if you will, of the human race, at least as old as the Stone Age.
So let's bring people into an example. I was thinking of one in my life inspired by your work, and perhaps you can take my example and run with it and pass along the lessons. Years ago, I was working on a documentary film. I had just moved to San Diego. I needed to hire a film assistant. I put a Craigslist ad out. I think approximately 30 female candidates showed up. The very first one was the most competent, but she scared me. I just moved to California. She was in a pantsuit. I don't know. She just scared me, and I didn't want to hire her on the spot. So I interviewed 29 other ladies, and they were just all not anywhere near her level. And then, in fact, the very last candidate, I can't even make this up. I laughed to myself about the very last candidate, as we were leaving, attempted to kiss me on the lips as an exit interview. So I went back and I hired the very first lady. And as it turns out, she ended up going to USC's film school and has a successful career now in LA. So it was a good choice, but I wasn't really using any kind of an algorithm probably described in your work. I was probably doing everything wrong.
Well, you certainly found yourself in one of the canonical problems of the 20th century, which is called the secretary problem. And it is almost exactly as you described. The canonical setup is you're hiring for a position and you get, N candidates. So in your case, 29 or 30 show up in a random order. At each step of the way, you evaluate the next candidate that comes in, and you have to either hire them on the spot and send everyone else away and never know if there might have been a better candidate out there, or you dismiss this candidate, in which case, in the classical version of the problem, you do not get the ability to call them back later and try to bring them back in. The crux of this problem is, how do you try to, of course, hire the very best person for the job without knowing in advance who that person is going to be? And at each step of the way, you're faced with making this irrevocable choice. Do you take the person in front of you and not know what else is out there, or do you send them away, but maybe you've just blown your best opportunity? This field in general is known as optimal stopping. And in the book, we sort of unpack the structure of optimal stopping problems and show that there are really a whole host of situations in life that take this form. And so one of the examples that we give is real estate. If you're looking to buy a house or rent an apartment, in most competitive markets, you are faced with exactly this kind of a dilemma where let's say you go to an open house and people are submitting bids pretty much on the spot. And so you have exactly this dilemma. How do you know when your best opportunity is without the ability to gather information and synthesize it before making a choice? And the classical version of the problem has this very famous solution, which is that you should refrain from making any offers for the first 37% of the applicant pool. And after that point, instantly extend an offer to the first person you see who's better than everyone you saw in the first 37%.
And it's very similar in thinking to something like a mathematical expectation type formula, where you're just saying, okay, you're not trying to say the absolute best. You're saying it's the best for right now. Let's make a decision. Let's move on.
I think there's a deeper point here about this problem, which is that even following the optimal solution, it does not guarantee that you're going to get the optimal result every time. What it can offer you is, in this case, the best probability of getting the best outcome. And I think at a slightly deeper level, what it can offer you is really peace of mind. That usually when we make a decision and we don't necessarily get the outcome that we want, the first thing that we do is kind of play back the entire thought process that led to the actions that we took and sort of call into question everything that we did along the way. And there's something, I think, very consoling about having a mathematical or a computational understanding of the form of the problem that you're facing, which is that it enables you to be confident even when you don't get the result that you want. You can still know hey, I followed the right procedure. I followed the right thought process in this case. Even if I didn't get the outcome I wanted, I don't have to call all of that into doubt because I know that I followed the right process.
Process versus outcome. They're not, I think that's one of the biggest issues we have in humanity today. We can have that great process, but we all still fixate on the outcome. Whereas we should be saying to ourselves, let's just follow a great process and know that we're going to have errors. We're going to have mistakes. But if we keep following the good process, we're going to be in a much better place in the long run.
I think that's exactly right. An understanding of the structure of the problem that we're facing, the basic characteristics of the optimal solutions, I think is a really powerful starting point in order to get a sense of what those processes should be.
And I'll give you an example in my world too. When you look at some of the traders today, let's say they have a 100% automated trading system and they'll get a signal that says buy. Well, most of the time, 60% of the time, perhaps that buy signal turns around, goes the other direction, and you have to take a small stop. As a human being, though, if you're just sitting there making the discretionary decision, you call into question, did I make the right move? Did I do the right thing? The computer just says, hey, I'm going to follow the rules. And we know in the long run, we want to get out if it doesn't go our direction. It's very, very similar to what you're outlining in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add also that, there are some people who are skeptical, for example, that the structure of a classic optimal stopping problem really does describe the types of decisions that we face in everyday life. I mean, there is this very strict assumption in the problem that at each moment in time you have this irrevocable choice. And in your case, you encountered a real life example where the assumptions of the model were a little bit relaxed. In the case of making that hire, you were able to go back and extend an offer to someone even if you didn't hire them on the spot. In fact, there are optimal algorithms for this version of the problem too, which is known as recall. Trading, I think, offers a wonderfully stark example where, as you describe, at each moment in time, you have this extremely fleeting and ephemeral opportunity. You must make a decision on the spot. If you buy, then you can't reverse that without some pain, right? But also, if you fail to act, then the opportunity may go away, and you don't have the opportunity to rectify that also. In fact, many aspects of the financial world are implicitly modeled using optimal stopping under the hood. I know that American stock options, for example, if you want to assign a value to the option to buy something or the option to sell something, how do you assign a value to that? Well, implicitly, you have to make some assumptions about whether that person is going to be able to know the correct time, the best time to exercise that option. The mathematics of optimal stopping are at work under the hood of some of these things that are familiar to traders.
As you talk, as you explain, I think back to my MBA program and I say to myself, I thought I really only learned two things of great value in my life: the definition of a sunk cost and an opportunity cost.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's right. It's right there in that, right in the same headspace. Let me let you tear apart another word. You mentioned it earlier, and plenty of people are going to know, but probability is a sticky wicket for people. But let's talk about probability, because again, it's the process versus outcome thing. And it's like whether we're talking poker or the MIT blackjack team, trading, VC financing, probability is really the success foundation of so many businesses today. And I don't think that's necessarily properly understood by so many people that don't have the training or the understanding.
Yeah, I think, furthermore, one of the key things that compounds the problem of dealing in probabilities is we're also dealing in uncertainties. That you might have information about two things, and you're trying to decide between them, but not only is the information probabilistic in nature, it's also uncertain. So to give you a concrete example, let's say there are two airlines that you fly. One of them you fly more than the other. Let's say one of them has been on time 9 out of 15 flights, so 60%. The other one you've only flown twice, and it was on time once, and it was late once, so only 50% performance. Simply put, you're trying to decide what's the smarter airline to take for your next flight. There's one that's been on time 60% of the time, 9 out of 15. The other's been on time 50% of the time, 1 out of 2. But in this case, it's compounded by this other factor, which is that you just don't have as much information about the second airline as you have about the first. How should we try to make the best decision when we're comparing these two different quantities? There's a famous problem in computer science called the multi-armed bandit problem, which is sort of an odd name, but it comes from the idea of the slot machine as the one-armed bandit. And it's exactly this. It's like you walk into a casino, there are all these slot machines that pay out at different rates with different probabilities. But crucially, you don't know which machines pay off at which rates and which are better than others until you start playing them. And I think that's something that's very true in many aspects of life. And so the critical thing to a computer scientist is what's called the explore-exploit trade-off. So you have to very consciously trade off how much energy you're going to spend gathering information and how much of your energy and your time and your money you're going to spend leveraging the information that you've already gained to try to get the best outcome that you can. And I think there are so many situations in life where we have to trade off in exactly this dimension. I mean, careers being one example where, you have people weighing, is it worth trying to start over in a different career track? Or is it worth going back to school to get this additional credential and things like this? Is it worth exploring this new business possibility? Or should I just sort of hone and refine the thing that I have? And in fact, mathematicians and computer scientists that have done some of the most important work on the multi-armed bandit problem and the explore-exploit trade-off have done a lot of it for companies that were explicitly trying to decide how to allocate their resources between these more exploratory things and the things that have a known payoff. So one of the best examples was that in the 1970s, the Unilever Corporation, pharmaceutical company, hires this mathematician, John Gittins, and they say, tell us what percentage of our budget we should be spending on R&D for experimental drugs and what percentage of our budget we should spend, on just marketing for drugs that are already profitable. And so this gives us a formal framework for thinking about what are otherwise kind of apples and oranges types of comparisons.
I love the one expression used in your work, and I could see it as a book title in the future. Win, stay, lose, shift.
Yes. So this was one of the very first results that came out in this area. So the multi-armed bandit problem has this really colorful history in the history of mathematics where for most of the 20th century, it was considered unsolvable. Not just a difficult problem, but literally unsolvable. And in fact, the Allied mathematicians in Great Britain during World War II joked about dropping the multi-armed bandit problem over Germany as the ultimate instrument of intellectual sabotage. But to the field's own surprise, they started making a series of gradual breakthroughs in the second half of the 20th century, kind of chipping away at the problem. And one of the first was this finding that this very simple algorithm called win, stay, lose, shift was better than just playing at random, which is a very modest result, but it was really the first key stepping stone towards the full solution of the problem. And the basic intuition behind win, stay, lose, shift is just if something worked, do it again. If you flew the airline and it was on time, fly them again the next time. If you went to a conference and it was profitable or otherwise kind of worthwhile, go again. If you went to a restaurant and you had a good meal there, go back. But the lose shift part of it means that as soon as you don't get a good outcome, try something else. So as soon as your airline is late, then try the competitor the next time.
You can see why I love this because I'm thinking immediately, again, in investment terms, and I'm thinking ride your winners, cut your losers.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a great example of what what is just this wonderfully intuitive and succinct policy that we're actually able to say, with the full rigor of the field, there are some really positive bounds that we can put on this. We can sort of certify that it's a reasonable approach. It's not necessarily the optimal approach, but it's pretty good, and it's extremely easy to implement.
The win-stay part of it is momentum almost. It's kind of like just follow the momentum. You don't necessarily know why. You might not be able to answer the why, but the win-stay, stay with it. And there's a lot of value to that. And that's very counter to human intuition, I believe.
The basic logic, at least if you're thinking about the formal version of the problem, is, if at time t, let's say, it made sense to go with a certain choice, a certain restaurant, a certain airline, you name it. If it already made sense to do that, and then you do it, and it pays off, well, it can only make more sense to do it again, because it can only raise your estimate of it paying off in the future.
Let me say for the audience right now, too, since I could literally sit here and ask you questions for hours, I'm not going to get you for hours. But even if I talked for hours, I would not even come close to covering 5%, 2%, 1% of what's in this book. This is extremely dense. And so I do highly recommend it to people to jump in. It's just a fantastic foundation. That said, I want to jump around a little on you. And I love one example, one story, and you can keep tying it into where we're going. But you talk about Jeff Bezos, and you talk about Jeff. Jeff is early in life at an investment firm, looking forward in life, and then imagining looking backward and thinking about that from an algorithmic standpoint. Why don't you explain that story? I think it's a fantastic way to bring people into your thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jeff Bezos, of course, we all know him now as the CEO of Amazon, but he started off in investment banking. He was at a very prestigious and successful firm. I believe it was D.E. Shaw, and he was working in New York City, and he has this inkling, as he explains to his boss at the time, that he wants to leave this investment firm and start an online bookstore in Seattle, which at the time just seemed like, insanity of why would you leave this extremely lucrative, successful position to do this thing that to pretty much anyone at the time seemed like just a total lark. This thing that was just so unlikely to work. And the way that he found himself framing that decision in his own mind was what he calls a regret minimization framework, which I think is a really lovely approach to decision making, where, as you say, he projected himself forward in time and imagined himself at 80 looking back. What he realized was that he would not regret having tried, even if he failed, but he would regret not having tried. And so from that perspective, it just made the decision incredibly easy for him. And of course, we all know what happened after that.
Well, if you put aside even the current day Amazon success, I really do think this idea of the regret minimization framework, I've never thought of it that way. And it is quite beautiful, because if you're a young person or whatever age you are, to say with the limited time that I have left, and that's always uncertain too, but to try and look ahead and say it that way, it changes the dynamics so much, because it really, if you're honest about it, it forces you out of the comfort zone to say, oh, wow, what am I afraid of, really? Because if I'm going to get to 80 and I'm going to look back, I don't want to just say I just clocked in every day for 50 years and I got a gold watch. It really is it's a great way to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's a little bit of a memento mori of sorts. It's kind of a lights a fire. But also, as you say, I think it's a really good analytical framework as well. Part of what I think is so lovely about this idea of regret minimization is that it has this formal parallel as well within the field. That there is explicitly a class of algorithms that are called regret minimization algorithms. For example, in the multi-armed bandit problem, you can formalize the notion of regret. So in this problem, you walk into this casino, there are all these different slot machines, but you don't know which ones pay out more than others until you start trying them. And so you can formalize the notion of regret as the money that you could have made if only you knew at the beginning of your time in the casino what you knew by the end. And so you can assign regret this very specific number. From there, you can ask all these sort of interesting mathematical questions. For example, how does your regret grow over time as a function of following, the best possible strategy? As it turns out, following the optimal algorithms in this problem, your regret will grow, specifically, it will grow logarithmically. The bad news is that even following the best possible strategy, you are still going to make mistakes. You're still going to continue making mistakes all the way through your life. But the frequency and the intensity of those mistakes will go down, and it will keep going down as you go through your life. And so that is something that I think is oddly consoling or very sort of heartening. Specifically, there are a set of algorithms called regret minimization algorithms that can offer this guarantee or this bound of logarithmic regret in that problem. And specifically, my favorite of these is what's called upper confidence bound. And this is another one of these things where I really feel like there's a profound life lesson in this very technical subject. So the idea of the upper confidence bound algorithm is that it says, for each of these opportunities, there is a kind of a confidence interval. There are these error bars around how good I think it could reasonably be. There's a middle of the bell curve where my sort of expectation lies, but there's also these tails that surround that, or these error bars that go both above and below. The upper confidence bound algorithm says just very simply, ignore your actual expectation of what's probably going to happen. Ignore the worst case scenario. Focus exclusively on doing the thing that has the best case scenario. And this is an algorithm that's been shown to minimize regret. And to me, that's just this very sort of human takeaway from this problem, that we can literally minimize our regrets in life by focusing on the things that have the most positive potential. To me, that's very profound.
From there, so we think about Bezos and this great framework. Now, of course, once he jumped, he then had to have his stopping point, Amazon, to some degree. Perhaps that wouldn't have worked out and he would have had to try another venture. I don't know. But it did work out. But there, on the flip side of this, there are many people that have that spirit that Jeff had, but perhaps, and I'm kind of reading from what you say here, but there's many people that they tend to over-explore. So they favor the new disproportionately over the best. You have these people that have the energy and excitement to go jump like Bezos did, but they keep jumping and they can never sit still.
Right. That there is the possibility to go too far in that direction. Yet one of the things that I think is quite interesting is having looked at the problem and looked at what characterizes the optimal strategies, the optimal algorithms in the scientific literature, there's this irresistible question, which is that what real people actually do in real life when they're confronted with these types of problems? In each chapter, we kind of delve into the psychology literature and say, what does it look like when you actually throw people into a lab setting and have them go through these sorts of tasks? Do they do what the optimal algorithm would have them do? In almost every case, the answer is no, they don't. And so there's a real opportunity there to ask, well, why is that? Is that because people are just, stupid or misinformed or kind of poorly designed by evolution for these sorts of tasks? Is it perhaps that it's the models that are wrong, that the people are in some sense doing something smarter than what the theory has gotten us to? In the case of explore-exploit problems, there is this very consistent result, which is that people tend to over-explore. They gather more information than they need to. They don't commit as much. They second-guess themselves more than they should, and that sort of thing. The famous experiment in which this comes up was one by Amos Tversky and some of his colleagues back in the either 60s or 70s. They had this setup where they had a box with two lights on it. one of the two lights would come on with varying frequency. And they said, okay, we're going to press this button that will turn one of these two lights on. We're going to do it 1,000 times. And each time you have the opportunity to either observe the light or place a bet on what you think which light you think is going to come on. But you do not get to observe which light came on. And you do not find out until the end of the experiment whether you won or lost money on that bet. It turns out that the optimal strategy in this case is, I believe, you make 38 observations in a row, and then you blindly place a series of 962 bets on whichever light came on more at the beginning. This is not what people do at all. They are much more exploratory. They gather much more information. They will observe for a long period of time, then they will make a series of bets, then they will go back to observing, then they will make a series of more bets, then they'll go back to observing. Well, someone had a closer look at the raw data from this study and came to a realization that I think is quite significant, which is if the probabilities that these different lights were coming on was on a random walk, if it was varying over time, well, then what the human subjects were doing is, in fact, extremely close to the optimal solution. This is a version of the problem known as the restless bandit problem. Then you can ask the question, well, okay, why are subjects behaving as though these payoffs are volatile when we've told them ahead of time that they're fixed? I think an appropriate response to that is, well, there's subjects in a psychology experiment, so I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to doubt the description of the scenario that the experimenters gave them, because there is a long storied history of psychology researchers lying to subjects. So I think it's probably appropriate that the subjects didn't take it on face value. But the deeper point here is that when you find yourself in one of these restless bandit problems, when the fundamental truths can change, the world itself can change, the environment that you're in can evolve, well, then you really should spend more of your time gathering information and commit for smaller stretches of time before gathering more information. And so it turns out that humans' instinct to quote-unquote over-explore is in fact very well adapted for the sort of dynamic and changing world that I think better describes a lot of the scenarios that we're actually in.
We also run the risk, though. Let's say an investor, for example, wants to make an investment in Tesla. How much information do you gather and when do you stop? These become tricky questions because in many ways, I can think of many investors that would say, I want the most simplistic data, a simple price momentum, and I'll bet off the price momentum alone, versus some other investors might say, I need to have, untold amounts of fundamental information, but the untold amounts of fundamental information never end.
Yes. Right. While you are gathering all that information, you might be missing out on your best opportunity, your best window, right, to buy.
Right.
And one of the key factors in any sort of explore or exploit problem is this question of how much time you feel you have. What is the interval of time over which you are trying to optimize? By analogy, if you are living abroad, let's say for a year, the first week that you're there, even if you discover an amazing restaurant, you probably don't want to go back twice in the same week because, the second restaurant that you try in that country has a 50% chance of being better. And the third restaurant you try has a 1 in 3 chance of being better, which is pretty high. And moreover, if you do find a restaurant that's better than the best one you already know about, you have 51 weeks to enjoy it and keep going back. Conversely, if you imagine yourself in the last week of your trip, well, the odds that a restaurant that you try the odds that a new restaurant you try is better than the best ones you already know about are quite small. You're able to set a pretty high bar as a result of your experience. But furthermore, even if you did find a restaurant that was better than the ones you already know about, you've run out of time to continue to enjoy that. one of the things that you find when you look at some of the solutions to the explore-exploit trade-off is that our decision-making can and should change as a function of where we perceive ourselves to be within that interval of time. And so this is, of course, something that comes up in investing contexts. If you have, a passive retirement account, for example, you sort of plug in your expected retirement year. A lot of these funds will typically pursue a very high-risk strategy 40 years out from retirement, and then gradually, for example, move the money from stocks into bonds as you get closer to retirement. And I think the same type of dynamic exists in this question of, do I continue to gather information, or do I just leverage the information that I have? It's partly a function of the amount of time over which you're going to be committed to your action. So if I'm committing if I'm committing a bunch of money into Tesla, to use your example, and it's going to be, locked in for, let's say, 50 years, then it probably makes sense to do a lot more of that fundamental research. But if I'm just going to be parking my money there for, a month or 6 months or something, then it's more important to just sort of try different things out and commit on the basis of what we already know.
Let me jump to another part of the book, something that I really liked, because I could stay in one chapter and just start picking your brain for the next hours. But computers have this really great technique, this capacity to multitask, and I'm going to let you explain it. It's called threading. But we as human beings, we really don't have this ability to thread, do we, effectively?
Yeah, I mean, not really. Just despite the fact that, one of the things that really distinguishes the brain from, a computational architectural standpoint, one of the things that really distinguishes the brain is this massive parallelism. It's ironic, given that we can't really process more than one, train of thought at a time, right? Or have more than one conscious, deliberate experience at a time. We have to kind of yank our attention back and forth. And in many ways, this is, in fact, quite like what computers do. They just do it at a much faster time scale, and so they can create the illusion of doing more than one thing at the same time through this process that's called threading. And the basic idea behind threading is that you have a series of processes that are running, but the CPU can only attend to one of them at a time. It will spend a little bit of time, flashing your cursor, and then yank itself to, your inbox, and spend a little bit of time, pinging to see if there's new mail in your inbox, and spend a little bit of time, buffering your audio so that your Spotify in the background keeps playing smoothly. And by hopping around from thing to thing nimbly enough and quickly enough, it can create this wonderful illusion of simultaneity. But as anyone who has used computers in the last 50 years can attest, sometimes this breaks down and we end up staring at the hourglass or the spinning beach ball of doom. And so I think it can be very instructive to understand what's actually going on under the surface in those cases, because I think there's really a connection between how a machine's time management can fall to pieces and some of the human traps that we all recognize from our own lives. The biggest pitfall for a system that's managing a multitude of threads is what's called thrashing. The basic idea behind thrashing is, as the computer is managing these different things, there's a certain amount of overhead associated with changing from one task to another. And this is known as context switching. So in a computer, that means you're repopulating your caches with different information. You are kind of bookmarking and saving your progress on the previous task so that you can come back to it later. You're finding your place in the next task and sort of queuing it up and getting started. And so there's a certain amount of fixed overhead associated with every context switch. And so if you imagine, let's just say for the sake of argument, it takes the system a tenth of a second to context switch. It's really more like a millionth of a second, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it's a tenth of a second. If you're doing 10 different things and you have a policy that you don't let something go longer than 1 second before you do at least a little bit of work on it, then the system ends up in a state where it only has a tenth of a second allocated to each task, but it requires the entirety of that tenth of a second just to page the sort of now where was I information back into its proverbial head. And so you can have a situation in which the computer is spending literally 100% of its time doing these sort of bookkeeping meta tasks. And what's really brutal about this situation is that because it is not actually advancing the state of any of its threads, it's extremely difficult to get out of. Because it's not doing any real work. And so it's not likely to terminate any of those processes and bring the system back to a more stable state.
Nice description of human nature, huh?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I see more of myself in that description than I'm, comfortable with. I think we've all had moments where we've felt, if you've ever spent, more time mentally keeping track of all of the things that you have to do than actually doing them, then you're basically in a position of thrashing, where the meta work and the bookkeeping has overwhelmed the actual work that you're doing.
Brian, let me bring up one more topic with you before I let you leave. This one really is near and dear to me. I'm so sad to see its demise, but I started as a Eudora Mail user probably in the mid 1990s. And what I loved about Eudora Mail is that, and I had to stop, I think in 2013, they stopped supporting it on the Mac. But what I loved about it is that I could sort things, right? But if I needed to search on Eudora Mail, and they've basically, all the folks in Silicon Valley have eliminated this opportunity for me. It does not exist. Eudora Mail still cannot be beat for search. If I wanted to search a decade of email and find anything from a thought to an IP address, you name it, Eudora search was just absolutely awesome. The searching versus sorting conundrum is something you cover in your work a lot. Why don't you speak to it some from your perspective, and maybe perhaps a lesson or a story that might give people a window into what you guys have discovered and put out for us?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the canonical domains of computer science that would be familiar to any computer science student is sorting algorithms. In many ways, this is one of the canonical computer tasks. How do you sort a set of things as efficiently as possible? In the book, we get into the history of sorting algorithms and what advice they might hold for us about the best way to, organize our household items like our bookshelves and so forth. But I think that the deeper principle here is that for a computer scientist or for a computer system, there is really one and only one reason that you would sort things in the first place, which is to save yourself time searching for those things later. That, I think, is a very deep point that leads to a way of thinking about the question of sorting, which is really, should you be sorting at all? Will the act of sorting something save you more time in subsequent searches than the act of sorting it would itself take?
It's a really deep thought.
And so you end up with, in many cases, a computational argument for mess. That there are a number of things in life that, we as humans attach kind of a moral dimension to, or a guilt with something being messy. When in fact, there is this argument that can be made in a number of situations where mess is not only the easy choice, but it can also be the optimal choice. computer science of all things. I mean, it's ironic because we think of computers as kind of the paragons of organization, but computer science gives us the language to actually formulate the rigorous argument for mess. And that for me is really sort of counterintuitive and cool.
It's very cool. Really, it's there's so many kind of aha moments in this work. I really appreciate you putting it together. I do want to read one last sentence, which I think for the audience to keep you thinking as to why this is important. And this is from your work. The underlying directive of any good algorithm is to minimize the labor of thought. We all want to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the kind of unintuitive things about computer science is that the goal of any algorithm is to minimize computing. To a computer scientist, computing in some sense is the enemy or is bad. And so I think there's something we can all sort of take heart in, that there's, in any decision-making process, there is this critical component of just knowing when to stop thinking or knowing how hard to think about something. And computer science gives us a way of not only making the best decision when we have perfect information and all the time in the world, but it also gives us a way of thinking about how to make smart trade-offs when we don't have those luxuries. And I think that's much more often the case that we find ourselves in.
Brian, the work, Algorithms to Live By, the Computer Science of Human Decisions, with your co-author, Tom Griffiths, available everywhere. I think it's doing really well, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, we're just in our third printing now, so it's been really encouraging to see the reception it's been getting.
You've got all Silicon Valley reading this, right?
Yeah. In fact, I just ran into a friend of mine on the subway. We were talking about the book, and the guy standing next to me, whips around and says, "Oh my God, you wrote Algorithms to Live By? I read that book." So yeah, it's really satisfying when you can feel like the work that you're doing is reaching people who are sensitive to it and who are able to take something out of it. That's really meaningful.
Beyond Amazon to buy, is there a website people should check out?
Algorithmstoliveby.com.
Brian, I thank you for taking the time. Hopefully I can have you on again when the next work comes, because I know a next work will come.
Absolutely. It's been a total pleasure. So I would love that. Thank you very much for having me.
And finally, coming in at number 4 for this mega episode, Matthew Walker. I'm not at university, I'm not in grad school, I'm not pursuing my PhD. But it sort of feels like I am. But here's the tricky part. I'm not in some niche, right? I get to talk to everyone. It's the coolest damn thing. Now here's a little secret about how I pursue my process. I think everybody I talk to is connected in some way, at least in my maniacal mind. I think it's all connected because it starts with skepticism. You start with skepticism, you go down a path, and you figure out an aha moment. And then you're left with something really cool that's useful for everyone, regardless of their endeavor in life. Oh, you're a trader, you're a trend-following trader, you're a short-term trader, you're an entrepreneur, you're a business person, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer. Hey, guess what? Oh, I forgot one also. You're a student. You're just a regular person. You're working at Starbucks. The episode today, I would like to make the argument that all of my episodes are the same in this context. But this episode today, it's for everyone. Because the topic of the conversation is something that we all have to deal with every day or we die. And what's that? Sleep. My guest today is Matthew Walker, British scientist, professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on the impact of sleep on human health and disease. I got lucky. I randomly caught Matt on Joe Rogan's show. Did not know anything about Matt, had not seen his book, dropped him an email, and I quickly realized that Matt is talking to a lot of people right now. He is getting this message out So I was so happy that I'm kind of a little late to the party, but Matt graciously responded, said, sure, I'll come on the podcast. Once again, I'm a lucky guy to be able to have all these expert minds on. And we are all lucky too, because you know what? Today, I'm giving you the absolute best way you can increase your performance. That's one aspect. And increase all of those things that connect to your human biology, your lifespan, your potential for disease, controlling and shaping your own DNA. Yeah, it's all through sleep. And my guest today, Matthew Walker, he's really laid down the gauntlet with all of us. You can listen or you can not listen. And for those of you that don't listen, what's wrong with you? I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Matthew Walker. So Matthew, in preparation for talking to you today, I did one little post on my Facebook. I said, hey, I actually didn't even say I was going to be having initially a conversation with anybody. I just said, look, if you're only getting 6 hours a night and you think it's enough, it's not enough. A fairly innocuous type statement. You would think most people instinctively know this, right? Oh my gosh, over 100 comments, got people in there screaming and yelling. You would have thought I had thrown down the gauntlet. One of the things that someone said as I kind of lead into this question, which was really interesting, is they said, well, you know, Tony Robbins has come out. And I love Tony Robbins. I think he's great things to say. You know, he says, Tony comes out, he says, he only gets 5 or 6 or less or something at peak optimization. He works fine at it. It works for him. Now, of course, there's always the outliers and the bell curve and all that kind of fun stuff. But I thought to myself, all of this angst that was existing on my Facebook thread, there was a certain level of machismo, I can just outwill this thing. And it felt very testosterone filled, right? And the funny thing is here I have all these guys that are showing their testosterone about how little sleep they need and the reality.
The irony.
Why don't you explain that irony?
Yeah, well, we know that men who are sleeping 6 hours or less a night will actually have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. That insufficient sleep that they are so proudly boasting about is actually serving to age them by a decade in terms of that aspect of virility and wellness. So unfortunately, the data is not supportive. And I would like to come back to the comment about those outliers, maybe Tony Robinson, people have before quoted to me Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, all short sleepers. The danger there is you're taking a sample of one person and then you're trying to apply it to the masses, rather than actually taking tens of thousands of scientific studies and looking at what those studies actually tell you. So I would tend to suggest people follow trend lines and not headlines. And headlines in this case is an individual. Trend lines is the science. And by the way, you noted too that people are fighting against this evolutionary mandate of 8 hours of sleep a night. And all I would say is that if science has taught us anything, whenever you fight biology, you normally lose. And the way that you know you've lost is through disease and sickness.
That was the thing that seemed to be missing on the responses to me, is the guys kept coming back about performance. I can kind of just push through to get to the performance. And I kept saying, hey, hold on. What about the biological elements going on here? They weren't even considering the aging, the potential dementia, the Alzheimer's, the high blood pressure, the potential heart attacks, cancer risks. They weren't even considering that. It was only I can push through to the performance.
Well, I think the phrase push through is critical here. Are you optimal or are you just pushing through? And second, one of the other things that we know is that your subjective sense of how well you're doing when you're not getting sufficient sleep is a miserable predictor of objectively actually how well you are doing when you're not getting enough sleep. In other words, you don't know you're sleep deprived when you're sleep deprived. So I think the analogy would be, a drunk driver at a bar. They've had 6 shots and they pick up their car keys. They say, look, I'm fine to drive home. And your response is, no, I know that subjectively you think you're fine to drive, but trust me, objectively, you're not. It's the same way with insufficient sleep. And that's why I usually imagine people who say those things truly just don't understand the performance deficit at that stage.
Let's start with a big picture. We've talked about numbers for a moment, but I think it'll really help those people that are unfamiliar with your work, unfamiliar with, frankly, the right way to sleep. Let's talk about that optimal number. I think I've seen you say the range is 7 to 9. Anything below 7, you can measure the impairment.
That's right. Yeah. So we know that once average human beings drop below that 7 number, that's when we can actually observe changes both in the brain and the body. But for example, if I were to put an individual on 7 hours of sleep for 3 weeks, at that stage, they would be as impaired in terms of their driving performance as they would be after one night of total sleep deprivation after going without sleep for 36 hours. So it's like compounding interest on a loan. It just aggregates and aggregates.
Hold on, you said it's 7 hours it does that.
Yeah. We know that 1 out of every 2 people in most developed nations is actually trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week. If I take you down to that level, it only takes 2 weeks to become as cognitively impaired as you would be after pulling an all-nighter.
Yeah, the all-nighter thing, I think back to my college days as a professor. You might laugh at this, but never one time, and I wasn't the greatest student, but that's a whole different issue, but never one time did I attempt to pull an all-nighter because instinctively, even though I did not have the knowledge that exists in your work, instinctively I knew I was useless if I tried to stay up all night.
Exactly that. And you can see that in performance. We did a study where we asked, in terms of learning and memory, is it a good idea to pull the all-nighter? So we took 2 groups of healthy adults. We gave one group a full night of sleep, the other we sleep deprived. And then we looked at how well they could cram facts into the brain the next day. And firstly, what we found is that when you are sleep deprived, your brain is 40% worse at learning new material. So 40. To put that in context of an exam, it would be the difference between acing it and failing it miserably. But what we also found, which was quite disturbing, is why the learning change was associated with a change in the brain. And specifically, there's a part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is almost like a memory inbox for the brain. That part of your brain was actually shut down when you were sleep deprived. So any new incoming memories were just being bounced. So you couldn't effectively commit new experiences to memory.
It is absolutely fascinating, the path that you've gone down. And before I dig even deeper, I want you to paint for me the passion. Now, you're my second psych guest from Berkeley. I had Alison Gopnik on, and she was great.
Wonderful.
She was fantastic. But what has been the driver for you? I want to lay this foundation. You're a very passionate guy. You've obviously gone down this, as an outsider looking in, I look at this path and I'm like, it's just so cool to see somebody go down a path that many people are not exploring and put something out that, frankly, I don't care where somebody sits on the political spectrum. This is useful information for everyone. And gosh, in such a polarized society, it's nice to have something where we can all perhaps say, oh my gosh, we can all talk about this. How did you get this passion? How did this start for you?
I think for a number of different reasons. Firstly, we know now that I think the global sleep loss epidemic is perhaps one of the greatest public health challenges that we now face in the 21st century. And I don't make that statement flippantly. We've got remarkable health challenges. We've got obesity, diabetes, we've got cancer, Alzheimer's disease. All of those individual disease states are desperately problematic. The issue, however, is that a lack of sleep sits like a superordinate node above all of those things. It's linked to every single disease that is killing us in the developed world, insufficient sleep. So by itself, it, I think, consumes more lives relative to any one of those in isolation. That was the first thing. The second thing was that if you look at this decline of sleep, this great depression of sleep over the last 100 years, it's staggering. Gallup did a poll in 1942, and they demonstrated that the average American adult was sleeping 7.9 hours a night. Now that number is down to only 6 hours and 31 minutes. In other words, within the space of 80 or 90 years, we have lopped off almost 20% of this mandated sleep need. It took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to put this essential thing called 8 hours of sleep in place. And we've just done away with, 20%, 25% of that. How could it not come with demonstrable health consequences, which it is? I just felt as though that message has not been adequately communicated to the public. So let me come back to your Twitter feed. A lot of people just didn't understand why proclaiming how they are doing fine on 6 hours and not worrying about the disease risk. Part of the reason is not just the sleep machismo attitude, which there is, and it's a problem, but it's the fault of people like me. I have not done or had not done a good job of describing the science of sleep, which we have known now for almost 30 years. And I think we are with our lack of sleep where we were with smoking 30 or 40 years ago. We knew all of the science, the carcinogenic, the cardiovascular consequences, but that data had not been out there. So society had not changed its beliefs and attitudes and behavior. It was only when science took 30 years to finally communicate publicly that data did we make a change, and we saved millions of lives. That's what needs to happen with sleep. That was the motivation to write the book. That's been the motivation to become much more of a public figure. I'm a very introverted person. Normally, I don't like being in the spotlight, but I feel so compelled because the disease and suffering that is present in the world right now because of our lack of sleep is so painful. It's not necessary. It's one of the greatest preventable diseases that nobody is talking about and no one is trying to solve.
We're going to have to talk about a lot of different things today that are just eye-opening, and perhaps somebody could frame it as negative. I look at your work, and I've actually seen you kind of say, hey, you've talked to audiences and you say, oh my gosh, I'm going to throw a lot of things at you today that might sound heavy, might not sound so nice. But there's another way to kind of look at this too, that once one absorbs your work, it's like, okay, oh my gosh, if I make certain choices, I get this performance boost that helps me on the performance of what I want to do in my life. It helps me on how long I want to live. How long I want to live, if I'm looking at your work correctly, is, from a bell curve perspective, is a choice when it comes to sleep, isn't it?
It's absolutely a choice. For most people, I think for some people, it may not be a choice. And I specifically am talking about people with sleep disorders where that obviously isn't a choice. And also some people from a socioeconomic perspective may just not be given through their work pressures the ability to sleep. But for the most part, I would say 90 to 95% of people who are underslept can do something about that. And you're right about the lifespan issue. What we know is the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. Short sleep predicts all-cause mortality. If you adopt that mindset of this idea, I can sleep when I'm dead, well, it is mortally unwise advice, and you will be both dead sooner and the quality of your now shorter life will be significantly worse. That's what epidemiological studies teach us.
Matthew, in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years going back in America, and it's different for other countries, but America's had this huge debate about healthcare and whether the healthcare should be private or public. And these debates, I can understand the different positions on different sides of the fences and all that kind of stuff. But what I never hear is something tangible. I never hear like a politician or a leader come out and start to talk about something like sleep. We can sit here, you and I can have this intellectual conversation about this, how important it is. It doesn't make a difference whether somebody is on the right or left. This is just fact. And how we can't get that to a higher level conversation where like literally the leaders of the free world should be giving national speeches about this topic, in my humble opinion. Am I completely nuts?
No, if the goal of any head of a nation is to try and improve the wealth and the health and the lifespan of their people, sleep should be one of their top priorities. Absolutely. That's what the data supports. Wealth as well. And I'd love to at some point dive into why less sleep does not equal more productivity. And in fact, sound sleep is sound business. But I'll come back to your question, though, which is a governmental one. I have been lobbying and been very vocal in every opportunity, and I'll take it here as well, to appeal to any first world nation that wants to work with me, because I have not yet seen any first world government that has issued a public health campaign regarding insufficient sleep. And it's puzzling because many of those countries have had wonderful public health movement conversations regarding eating, regarding exercise, regarding things like flu vaccination, regarding drink driving, drugs of abuse, Where is the missing piece in that puzzle? That is sleep. Sleep is the neglected stepsister in the health conversation of today, and it is not on the priority list of any government. They could make demonstrable changes that would save them as a government huge amounts of money. And I'll give you a fact. The Rand Corporation, an independent survey group, looked at the enormous cost of sleep deprivation in many first world nations. What they found was that a lack of sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. In America, that was $411 billion. In Japan, it was $138 billion. In the United Kingdom, my home country, it was $50 billion. If you solve the sleep loss epidemic within countries, you could almost double the budget for education, or you could halve the healthcare deficit in some of these countries.
So let's open up some of the contradictions and conflicts with what you describe. If I walk into any airport around this world, one of the primary things they are attempting to sell to me, and look, I'm a guy who's approaching 50. I'm a yoga nut. I drink maybe one beer a month if I'm lucky. Okay, so I'm not saying I'm all that. I'm just saying that's what I'm describing. So look, if I walk into that airport, though, all I see are racks and racks and racks of brown, and I want to throw an expletive here, but I won't, but I see racks and racks and racks of brown liquor, right? And so all these people are buying this brown liquor. So even if we go out there, we have all these governments say, hey, here's the right way to do it. Then they go to the airport, they buy the bottle of brown liquor, they go home, they guzzle it down, and what happens to their sleep, Professor?
Well, alcohol is probably one of the most misunderstood drugs when it comes to sleep. It's commonly used as a sleep aid. Many people turn to alcohol when over-the-counter sleep aids fail for them. They think it helps them fall asleep more quickly. It doesn't. Unfortunately, alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. So all you're doing when you have a nightcap is actually just knocking out your brain, specifically the cortex, which sits on top of the brain. So firstly, you're not getting natural sleep when you're drinking alcohol, but then there are two other problems. Firstly, alcohol will fragment your sleep throughout the night, so you wake up many more times. The problem is that they are so brief that they tend not to be remembered. But when you wake up the next morning, you feel lousy, you don't feel refreshed, you don't feel restored, but you never link two and two together because you don't remember waking up so much. If those two things weren't bad enough, unfortunately, this makes me deeply unpopular, by the way.
No, not with me. Not with me. I don't drink, so.
But it's okay. For the most part, I'm an unpopular guy anyway, so I guess I'm already at floor levels. The final problem with alcohol, with sleep, is that it will actually block your REM sleep, or what we call your rapid eye movement sleep, which is essential for a number of brain functions, including creativity, insight, problem solving, as well as emotional and mental health. When you add all of those three things together, alcohol is a profoundly sleep disruptive drug. And if you want good sleep, it's to be abstained from. Of course, I don't want to be puritanical. Life, to some degree, is to be lived. But all I'm here to do is try to describe the science and what we know to be truth, and then allow people to make an informed choice with their behaviors.
Life is to be lived, but it's going to be a shorter life if everyone goes down some of these paths.
It is. And, I think, some of the comments I've sometimes had from media that I've done, people will say, well, yes, but if I'm sleeping just 6 hours a night versus 8 hours, I'm awake for 2 hours every day. Maybe I'll die at 60, but if I get 2 hours extra every day, then I'm still probably going to have just as much life as I would do if I slept 8 hours. Firstly, the problem with that is those years that you have lived are going to be more unhealthy. So you're going to have a shorter lifespan, but more importantly, you're going to have a shorter health span. The other thing is that, yes, you may be awake for longer, but you're also going to be largely in a stupor because you're so sleep deprived. So I don't think it's the type of quality, it would be like watching a YouTube that is, on 144 DPI. Why would you do that when you could watch it at 1080 high resolution? That's what a full 8 hours of sleep actually is.
I saw you on a national TV broadcast, a morning show, and it seemed to me some of the questions, and one of the host was asking, he was older and he was asking some questions. And I just he felt so obligatory, like meaning, okay, we got the sleep guy here. Let's ask him some questions and move on to the next segment. I mean, there was just I guess I see your point where some people don't like what you're having to say, because I guess I've witnessed it in my own preparation for this conversation. So it's really amazing that people aren't more open-minded, because it's fascinating that once people go, like yourself, researchers go down this path, figure all this out, smart people should say, oh my gosh, this is great. Let's adopt this.
One of the potential problems here is that people become so used to feeling as though they are okay with 6 hours that they can't believe that they need more. But what's remarkable, I get this a lot on social media. People say, okay, I heard Matt speak, and I decided to try the experiment. I tried getting, 8 hours of sleep opportunity every night. And my goodness, I never realized I could feel this way. So I think that's the first thing, this misbelief that 8 hours will actually give you something more than you're currently feeling, because you've reset your baseline into this kind of dull state of non-optimality, and you don't realize that you can be so much more. A lot of people say, well, this is just me at age 50. If you get 8 hours at age 50, you may actually start feeling 40. But I think the other problem, though, in terms of the pushback, is that sleep has an image problem. That in society in this day and age, we equate getting sufficient sleep with this concept of laziness, that if you're getting 8 hours of sleep, then you're slothful. It's surprising to me for at least two reasons. Firstly, human beings are the only species that will deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent good reason. And second, even we human beings don't always hold that attitude of sleep being useless, because no one looks at a baby sleeping during the day and says, well, what a lazy baby. And we don't, because we know that sleep at that time of life is non-negotiable. It's absolutely essential. But if you look at the data, somewhere now between infancy and even childhood, we abandon the notion that sleep is important and necessary and to be celebrated and embraced, and we chastise it and we stigmatize it with this label of laziness. And I think that that's a huge problem. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I face.
So Matthew, in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, all the rage has been the legalization of marijuana across various states. And I have smoked marijuana. When I was younger, I tried whatever, I just didn't like the feeling of smoke in my body, whether it's a cigarette or marijuana or whatever. But look, plenty of people do. And back to the alcohol point, what's marijuana doing to sleep? I mean, if everybody right now thinks it's wonderful that there's all these publicly traded companies and we could all make all this money buying marijuana, but everyone's stoned, what's happening to all those folks that think there's no ramifications to getting high on their sleep?
Marijuana does actually speed up the time it takes you to fall asleep. It's called your sleep onset latency, which just means how long does it take you to fall asleep? And people seem to fall asleep in a shorter amount of time. The problem, however, with marijuana is that, like alcohol, but through a different mechanism, it also seems to block rapid eye movement sleep or dream sleep too. One of the problems there comes back to mental health issues. We and others have done studies where you will selectively deprive individuals of this thing called rapid eye movement sleep, which is otherwise known as dream sleep. And if you do that night after night, just selectively depriving them of rapid eye movement sleep, so they still sleep maybe 7.5 hours, but you've just prevented them from getting any dream sleep, because as soon as they go into dream sleep, we go into the room in the sleep center, we wake them up, and then they fall back asleep, we wake them up again. After about 3 or 4 days of that, people start to have hallucinations and delusions, and essentially they start to show signs of going into psychosis. They become psychotic, believing things that aren't true. They have paranoia, seeing things which are not there. You could imagine that if there is something like alcohol or marijuana that is routinely and chronically depriving your brain of REM sleep, it may heighten your risk for aspects of psychosis and mental health disorders. So I think it's one of those unspoken about dangers when it comes to those drugs. Now, we also don't know if some of the other variants of marijuana, looking at CBD oil, for example, some people use that, which doesn't necessarily have the euphoric sort of feelings that come along with classic marijuana. We don't know what those things like CBD oil actually do to sleep and whether or not they are less disruptive. So could you still get some of the speeding up of the time that it takes you to fall asleep, but without the detrimental blocking of REM sleep? We don't know. That's unclear right now. But people should be aware of that.
Let me keep down the path of a couple more of these big picture issues that affect our sleep that we all really don't think about so much. And I think now, especially in the last 10 years, the age of the iPhone, and this one I'm guilty of. I am so guilty of this one, which is going to bed and feeling like I'm relaxing by sitting there at night and, checking something online on my phone or whatnot. Speak to me about what your research, all your hard work has taught us about this device usage at night, having too much light at night. And, I've had a lot of people come back to me and they want to talk about the blue light issue. Frame some of these topics together so that people can understand what you have learned.
So there are at least 3 ways that those gadgets will disrupt your sleep. The first is using them before sleep. For example, studies done where if you read on an iPad for 1 hour before bed, relative to just reading a book in dim light, the iPad will actually block the release of a critical sleep timing hormone called melatonin. And you need melatonin to rise in the evening to help tell your brain when it is time to fall asleep. And when it's at a high concentration, that's when your brain is instructed to get sleep, sort of time the onset of sleep. Well, if you're using those blue light devices, your brain is fooled into thinking it's still daytime. And so it puts the brakes on that hormone called melatonin, and melatonin is not released. And therefore, you're not going to feel sleepy. And in fact, it will delay the rise of that melatonin by up to 3 hours. So in other words, if I'm here in California, in Berkeley, and I read for an hour on my iPad, my peak melatonin, which should normally be present for me probably around about 10 o'clock in the evening, that's not going to arrive until 1 a.m. In other words, I'm now on Hawaii time. It puts me there in terms of a time zone. So that's the first problem with these devices, the blue light. It's actually light of all kinds, by the way. Blue light is especially damaging, but even just normal indoor lighting, I think the recommendation to people would be try turning down half of the lights in your house in the last hour before you go to bed. You may be surprised at how sleep enhancing and how tired and good your sleep becomes when you do that, and certainly doing away with the gadgets. The 2 other ways that these devices become problematic with sleep, the first is what we call sleep procrastination. It is a thing, which means that you get into bed, you've got your phone by your side or your iPad, and you're sleepy. You could fall asleep just fine, but you think, I should maybe just check email one last time. I should just post on Twitter one last time, or I'll check Facebook, or I'll do Amazon, or those things quickly add up, and all of a sudden you look at the clock and now it's 30 minutes later and you've just lost half an hour of sleep. That sleep procrastination becomes a problem. The final thing is what we call anticipatory anxiety. Many people listening probably have had that feeling where if you've got a really early morning flight that is absolutely critical, let's say it's for a job interview and you've got to make that flight, you know for a fact that you're not going to sleep well the night before. You may fall asleep and stay asleep, but the depth of your sleep is just not as deep.
I hate this. It drives me crazy. This is the one I'm most guilty of.
It's an awful thing. But what happens when you leave your phone there, even if you're good and you put it into airplane mode, just that fact, because most people, if you look at the data, the first thing that most people do when they wake up in the morning, they swipe, they unlock, and then this world of anxiety comes flooding in. Emails, text messages, tweets, all of these things which ramp up the fight or flight branch of your nervous system, which is what causes anxiety and stress. Just knowing that that's what you have to look forward to each and every morning is a low-grade form of that early morning flight that is absolutely essential. And the studies have demonstrated that the depth of your sleep is not as deep when you're anticipating that anxiety the next morning. So those are the 3 ways that technology has been a problem in terms of the bedroom.
Switching back to the biology part here, I had a guest on this show years back named Sharon Moholem, and the subtitle of his book was How Our Genes Change Our Lives and How Our Lives Change Our Genes. Professor, the floor is yours to explain to people on a very, very micro level what's going on when we have this lack of sleep to our genes, our DNA.
That's perhaps some of the most frightening data that we've seen come out recently, which is that if increasing your risk for developing things like cancer or Alzheimer's disease were not sufficiently disquieting enough, we have since discovered that a lack of sleep will even erode the very fabric of biological life itself, which is your DNA genetic code. And in one study, they actually took a group of otherwise completely healthy adults and they limited them to 1 week of 6 hours of sleep. And then they measured the change in their gene activity profile relative to those very same subjects when they were getting 8 hours of sleep. And there were two critical findings. The first was that a sizable and significant 711 genes were changed in their activity caused by that insufficient sleep, which is relevant, by the way, not just in terms of its number, but also because of the sleep manipulation. We're not talking about total sleep deprivation here. A lot of people are trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep or less during the week. So this is a very, what I would say is ecologically relevant. In other words, it's relevant to most people's lives in terms of an experimental change. The second result perhaps was even more important. About half of those genes were actually suppressed in their activity. The other half were actually amplified in their activity. Those genes that were suppressed were genes that were related to numerous aspects of your immune system. So in other words, you start to become immune deficient at a genetic level by way of 6 hours of sleep for 1 week. Those genes that were actually amplified or over-exaggerated in terms of their expression were genes that were related to the promotion of tumors, genes that were associated with long-term chronic inflammation within the body, and genes that were associated with stress and, as a result, cardiovascular disease. I think, the take-home message for me from those types of findings is that many people in the public feel uncomfortable about the idea of, let's say, genetically modified food or even genetically modified embryos. But by choosing to get insufficient sleep, we now must all accept that we are performing a similar genetic modifying experiment on ourselves. And if we don't let our children get the sleep that they need, we are inflicting a similar genetic engineering experiment on them as well.
You mentioned we are choosing, and that was something that happened in my Facebook thread, is several people said, well, they kind of were saying, I'm not choosing this. I just can't get it. They weren't even allowing themselves to step back and say, hold on, let's do an inventory here. What is my routine and what's an optimal routine? And let's see if I can make some changes to get to the optimal routine. They weren't even considering that. It was just, I can't sleep well.
Yeah. And for some people, they may actually be, very good in terms of their dedication to an 8-hour sleep opportunity every night. But they may be suffering from, probably the second most common sleep disorder, which is, or probably actually it's probably the most common, which is insomnia. There are two forms of insomnia, one that we call sleep onset insomnia. The other is called sleep maintenance insomnia. They're not mutually exclusive. In other words, you find it difficult to fall asleep or you find it difficult to stay asleep. And those are hugely problematic. We know that the prevalence rates are somewhere between 12 to 15%. 1 out of every 10 people that you walk past on the street has clinical grade insomnia. And actually, it's very difficult to get a diagnosis because the threshold clinically to have a diagnosis of insomnia is very, very difficult. If you scale that back and relax the threshold a little bit, what we know is that 1 out of every 2 people, every 2 adults in most societies report struggling with their sleep at least once a week. Testament to that is the fact that here in America, in the last month, 10 million people will have swallowed some kind of sleep aid, which is, to me, just one of the most profound demonstrations of how desperate people are for sleep. Another way to phrase this is that, it took George Lucas with the Star Wars franchise, I think about 40 years to amass about $4 billion in profit in revenue generation. Well, it took Ambien less than 2 years to generate that same $4 billion in profit.
It's also blocking in other ways, not unlike alcohol and marijuana too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other conversation to have. And it was probably one of the most debated with my publishers chapters in the book. In the book, there is an entire chapter on sleeping pills and whether you should or should not take them. And I make some quite significant claims, but it's all backed up in the science, and the legal team released it. It was solid. What we firstly know is that sleeping pills, like alcohol, are also sedatives. They're called sedative hypnotics. And again, sedation is not the same as sleep. But we also know that the depth of the deep sleep that you get when you're on those drugs isn't the same. So you don't feel as refreshed. You can often feel groggy the next day. Perhaps what was more concerning and what caused the problems or concerns with the book was that there is now very good evidence that sleeping pills are associated with a significantly higher risk of death as well as cancer. And it is considerably higher. There was one study that looked at 20,000 controls versus 10,000 people taking sleeping pills. What they found was that if you are taking sleeping pills, you're about 3 to 4 times more likely to die across a 2.5-year period than those people who are not taking sleeping pills. It doesn't take much. Even just 5 pills to something like 30 pills a year still increased your death risk by almost 200%.
I don't know if I've ever had a conversation with someone, and I've seen some of your work already. It's the biggest PSA ever. I mean, it's like just amazing information. Look, I know you're not the only guy involved in the research, but you're a big leader right now, and it's just amazing. I mean, this should cause people to shake. Like, how did I not know this? Why are we not talking about this? Why do all my family members and friends not know about this? Everyone should know about this.
Yeah, and I think, that was what was heartwarming in reading a lot of the comments on the reviews of the book on websites like Amazon, etc., was how eye-opening it was for people and how they became essentially, sleep ambassadors themselves. They were just so struck, and they would say, I just can't stop telling everyone about this critical necessity of sleep. I'm buying the book for people. I'm sending them all of this information, because when you understand, how essential it is, sleep is Mother Nature's best effort yet at immortality. It is the greatest healthcare system that you could ever wish for. And it is, for the most part, democratically available to everyone. And that's why I continue to fight for this thing called sleep. And I am so keen to reunite humanity with the sleep that it is so bereft of. Because, I don't want people to suffer. And I also know just economically, it makes a huge amount of sense. And I could give you one very easy, simple example. We know that if you are getting just 5 hours of sleep a night in the week before you get your flu shot, you will only produce about 50% of the normal antibody response, rendering that flu vaccination largely useless. And we know, for example, in America, that the flu costs the economy about $10 billion directly. It's about $100 billion indirectly, all told. If we could simply just get, by way of maybe sleep trackers and intelligent software, people sleeping sufficiently in the week before they get their flu shot, we could dramatically alter deaths as well as morbidity associated with every single flu season. And it would germinate productivity in the workplace because you're not losing those days of sickness.
Let me give you a kind of fun one in the middle of this conversation. So years ago, in my mid-20s, I was going down this path of having conversations and talking with masters of the universe traders on Wall Street. And I remember I went to this one guy's office in Stamford, Connecticut. His name was Mark. So if he's listening, hopefully he will laugh. I won't say his last name, but he was a big guy. He's like 6'5". We sat down, we had this nice conversation. He was so cool, gave me all these insights as a guy kind of coming along that really didn't know how any of this stuff worked. And he told me in the middle of our conversation that he had a process for working on new problems and learning. And he would take this, whatever he was working on, with him, and he would lay down at night to go to bed. He'd be thinking about it, and he'd put a little piece of paper and a pencil next to his bed, and he would work on it while he slept, and then he would wake up in the morning and he'd write down notes or something. And I remember thinking, as like a 25, 26-year-old guy, I remember thinking, okay, I don't know how this all works. Okay, this guy's really, really smart. He's really successful, but this sounds really freaking nuts. This doesn't sound normal. And I remember thinking like, okay, I don't know how to really, I don't know where to put this one. But, now I'm going through your work and I'm kind of like, you know what? I think I know where to put this.
Yeah. And there's a reason that you've never been told to stay awake on a problem. And we know from good scientific data that sleep can actually produce about a threefold increase in creativity and problem solving. These studies have been well performed. We've done a lot of these studies too on sleep and creativity. And there's lots of wonderful anecdotes to support that too. Musical anecdotes. We know that McCartney had some great compositions. Let It Be came to him in a dream. We know that Keith Richards would go to sleep with a cassette recorder and his guitar in his bed, and probably a lot of other things in his bed at the time as well. But let's set that aside for a second, because he knew that sleep could at some point just grip him with creative insight. And in fact, he reports in his autobiography that the opening chords to Satisfaction, the most famous Rolling Stones song, actually came to him in terms of dream-inspired insight. He said that, every night he would press record and then he would go to sleep. And the next morning he woke up and he rewound the tape. He played it back and he said, there in some ghostly image were the opening chords of Satisfaction that I'd played in the middle of the night, followed by about 43 minutes of snoring. But it did come to him, gifted by way of sleep. This idea that what sleep, and specifically it seems to be dream sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, dream sleep is a form of informational alchemy. It's during dream sleep that the brain takes all of the recently learned information and then starts to collide it and intersect it with all of your back catalog of information. So you start to test out new associations, you start to seek new connections, and you wake up with a revised mind-wide web that is capable of divining incredible ideas and solutions to previously impenetrable problems.
Let me take you to something else that happened in my thread. And I had one guy that was trying to make the case that younger people literally don't need the sleep. And you have done some work and you've put some studies together, perhaps other research too that you've brought in and aggregated. The school start time. That one is one of those aha moments that should cause parents to just go, oh my God, OMG, as they might say in Saigon, Vietnam, Troy, oi. It's one of those ones. And talk about the school start time and connect it with some of the research on the SATs.
So I think in, 10 or 15 years' time, we will look back and we will be desperately ashamed about the earliness of school start times, because the data is fast accumulating, and I think it is now unequivocal. One of the earliest studies that looked at this happened in America, in Minnesota, and they shifted their school start times from 7:25 to 8:30 in the morning. And the first thing to note, by the way, about that is, what are we doing trying to educate our next generation at 7:25 in the morning? It's clearly not a good idea, because for a 7:25 start, school buses will begin leaving at 5:30 in the morning, which means that some kids are having to wake up at 5:15 or 5 o'clock or even earlier, which to me is utter lunacy. But to get back to the study, they looked at the SAT scores. In the year before they made the time change, when kids were going to school at 7:25 in the morning, the average SAT score of the top performers was 1,288, which it turns out is a very respectable score. The following year, when they were going to school at 8:30 in the morning, the average SAT score was 1,500, which is a 212-point increase. In other words, that will dramatically change which tier of university those kids go to, and as a consequence, their ultimate life trajectory. I think people have questioned some aspects of that early study, perhaps for good reason. But in all of the subsequent studies that we've done, the data now, I think, is very clear. Academic grades increase, behavioral problems decrease, truancy rates also decrease, and then we also see psychiatric and psychological problems. They too also decrease dramatically.
It's just one of these things where when you start to wrap your mind around how many of these different variables that we are in control over, that we mess up on, and how it affects our lives. I mean, look, here's another one, daylight savings time. I currently am in a culture, a country that doesn't operate with it, so the time changes. But if I'm in this country for a year, then 6 months of the year, I'm plus 11 hours East Coast US, and 6 months of the year, I'm plus 12. Daylight savings time, pretty much from what I can tell from your work, is not a good thing.
It can be a killer, unfortunately. Well, and I think daylight savings time is probably the largest global sleep experiment that happens. It's performed essentially on 1.6 billion people across about 70 countries twice a year, of course. And what you find if you look at the data is in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, there is a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks. But in the autumn, in the fall, when we gain an hour of sleep, there's a 21% reduction in heart attacks as a result. So I think that's how vulnerable our bodies are to even just 1 hour of lost sleep across one single night, let alone several hours of lost sleep across weeks, months, if not years.
As we wind down here, Matthew, I want to bring it back to something we talked about at the very beginning. We were talking about testosterone. We were talking about men. And you brought up the numbers talking about what happens in terms of your testosterone production going down. But I've seen you make the case in public too. It's also a size issue. Literally, there is a testicle size issue going on with a lack of sleep. Why don't you really get very graphic there so my male friends out there can perhaps even wrap their arms around this even more?
Yeah, not only is a lack of sleep going to sort of be emasculating at the level of testosterone, but men who sleep 5 to 6 hours a night do have significantly smaller testicles than those who sleep 8 hours or more. We also know that they have more deformities in terms of their sperm. And it's not just men, by the way. It's also, we see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health caused by insufficient sleep. And that's why, from a very non-humor perspective, if you have a young couple that's trying to conceive, but they're both not getting sufficient sleep, that's a very difficult challenge because of these demonstrable changes in the reproductive system caused by a lack of sleep.
Hey, one last thing too. This is really, I think, a really important one for people to consider. Statistics is a very difficult subject for people. And when I posted this comment, somebody came back and they said, well, look at this guy, David Wells. He was a pitcher for the Yankees. He was very overweight and he would go out and party every night. And he pitched a perfect game, and he said, 3 or 4 hours sleep or something. And so this person comes onto my, Facebook and says, well, look at David Wells. Look at this example. And I think people really need to grasp the idea of a bell curve and not just go hunting. And you've already said this in this podcast, not just go hunting for that extreme outlier, because if everyone imagines themselves being the outlier, then it's just illogical. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, outliers, are usually used for confirmation bias to support your own, predilection. And that's always dangerous. You should always just be open to the data. And I think with sleep, one of the other issues to keep in mind too is that the number of people who can, well, actually, let me say it this way. A lack of sleep is going to get you one way or another, and it can get you acutely or it can get you chronically. One way that lack of sleep will pop you out the gene pool and end your life very quickly is drowsy driving. We know that insufficient sleep causes more car accidents than either drugs or alcohol combined. And we know that is far more deathly as well as a consequence. The reason is because when you have what's called a micro sleep behind the wheel, where you just the brain essentially just falls into a sleep state for just a second or two, at that point, you tend to make no reaction at all to an accident potential event. Whereas when you're drunk or you're intoxicated, you're just making an action that is too late, but you're still making an action. That's why insufficient sleep is much more deathly from a road traffic accident perspective. So firstly, if you're bragging about, maybe outliers or, people may be able to get away with it for one day in terms of driving, but it can get you acutely in that way. The other thing, though, is chronically. That's how a lack of sleep will ultimately impact most people. And a good example here is hypertension. A lot of people don't know that they have high blood pressure, and they can be doing the wrong things for year after year after year. And they say, well, look, I'm smoking and I drink and, I kind of eat lousy food, but look at me. I'm strong as an ox and I'm still standing here in front of you. But then 10 years later, they suffer a massive coronary or they die of a brain hemorrhage because of a stroke due to that hypertension. It's the same way with sleep. You don't know you're not getting sufficient sleep when you're not getting sufficient sleep. You're not aware of it, but it will get you, unfortunately. The elastic band of sleep deprivation will stretch only so far before it snaps.
I got to share with you really quick, really fun little story I did when I was like 20 years old. I was driving from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. It's about a 20-hour drive. I didn't know anything about how sleep would affect my body or whatnot. So I figured, okay, I'll try to sleep during the day and I'll start driving at 11 o'clock at night. I'll take a bunch of Vivarin, I thought, okay, I can just drive all the way through the night to get to New Orleans. I got to about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and I was passed out in my car on the side of the road. So,
well, and that's the right thing to do. It's just not worth it. Either you could lose your own life or you could take someone else's life.
The book, Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. Matthew, where's the best place beyond Amazon where people should go buy this book? This is one of those books that you should, I actually just bought 3 copies for my family and just sent it to them. Where should people go to check you out? Where's the best place beyond a Google search? They can find you everywhere. But is there a website?
I do. I have a website and I'm on social media and it's all Sleep Diplomat. So I'm on Twitter at Sleep Diplomat. I'm on the web. sleepdiplomat.com. The same thing in terms of LinkedIn. So people will find me there, unfortunately or fortunately.
You've sure picked a topic that I think most rational people, most rational people, I'm not sure calling humans rational is smart, but for most rational people out there, this is one of those topics that's pretty universal. So, hey, listen, I appreciate the work and best of luck and can't wait to see all the new things you figure out in the years to come.
Thank you so much and a privilege to be on the show, Mike. Thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.